When I heard that Luc Ranieri, a polymath and linguistic maestro, known for his amazing YouTube channels Polymathy and Scorpiomartianus, is currently tackling the ambitious task of memorizing the first 100 lines of the Iliad, I knew I had to talk to him. Now, there's a couple of motivations here. Part of the reason is I just want to hear more about his thoughts on memorizing lines like these, which he describes beautifully in the intro to Iliad 100, which I highly recommend you check out. Another reason is that I myself have memorized a wee few lines of the Iliad using Edward Smith Stanley, the 14th Earl of Derby's translation of the Iliad, and it happened pretty much by accident. It was a demonstration that I did during the early years of developing what is now known as the magnetic memory method. And it was because an early business mentor of mine named Haiti Windy, she gave me a job, actually, that helped make developing this project during those strange early days possible. She was very, very skeptical about the mnemonic methods I was talking about, especially the way I was talking about them. And I just asked her, we were sitting at a park, I said, well, what do you want me to memorize? And she opened up a Kindle app and just sort of randomly picked something and handed it over to me, and there it was, the lines of the Iliad in this kind of quirky but interesting translation. Of Peleus son Achilles sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. And I used her own office in Burnaby, which is part of Vancouver, to demonstrate, okay, so here in your office, I'm going to have a pail, and Brad Pitt is going to kick it. He had played Achilles, I believe, of Peleus son Achilles, sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly. Anyway, without going through the whole thing, she was pretty amazed that I could do that. And before I knew it, she was memorizing things too, and became a wonderful, wonderful person who helped me get this project started. So it's a personal thing when I heard that Luc was memorizing this. And this whole approach also really inspired me because in his intro, Luc uses the word the ineffable. And I've always thought that memory techniques are both very, very practical, but also ineffable. They truly are. And if you don't know what the word ineffable means, don't worry. I don't know what it means either. It's for beyond, things that are inexpressible. We don't have words for what we're trying to describe. And quite frankly, I don't have words to describe Luc's incredible body of work overall. I mean, I think I make a lot of videos and so forth, but he takes the cake. He's not only a linguistic maestro and a polymath, but he demonstrates this through all kinds of ways through his YouTube channel. He's also a Latin teacher of high repute, and he's even been featured on the Vatican's radio station. So, if that isn't street cred, I don't know what is. He's immersed himself in the study of numerous languages. His dedication is super inspiring. And I just wonder, he's a guiding light in the world of classical education. And, Lucas Amadeus Ranierius, maybe there's an etymological connection there to the word and the idea of light that I'll have to ask him about next time when we follow up to see how he did memorizing the entire 100 lines. For now, I ask Luc quite a few questions about his approach and his experiences learning ancient languages. And I don't want to spoil the plot, but Luc is an aviation enthusiast, a military pilot. He's flown a variety of helicopters with names that would challenge the best of the memory competitors, like TH-67 Creek and UH-60AL Blackhawk, and on and on. And it's a lot more than just ineffable, the unexpressible that memory can bring to you. As he points out, it can be a matter of life and death to have a good memory. So I sometimes feel a little bit ill when I record these interviews, and my mouth was just not functioning well during our chat. I dropped words like crazy sometimes. Tertva and Hatva were completely gone from my mind for some reason. But I'm glad those things happened because the matter of pronunciation ultimately came up. And I don't want to bury the lead and dwell on it too much now, but I get corrected by keyboard warriors on my pronunciation all the time, by people who often don't really understand. My lips are often quite cracked when I'm trying to speak. I'm missing a lot of teeth from an accident back when I was 12, and I'm 80% deaf in one ear. I'm surprised I can even pronounce my own name. But during our conversation, Luc and I delve much deeper than just the process of how he's memorizing the Iliad and how he's learned multiple languages and how these techniques can revolutionize your language learning. But Luke introduces a term I'd never heard used quite the same way before when it comes to unveiling who the pronunciation police really are and how they might really tick behind their anonymous usernames. All fascinating stuff. And as usual, as happens with guests who commit things to memory, we take a deep dive into the art of memory itself. And I'm going to continue that adventure in the conclusion to this interview for those of you who are very, very interested in applying memory techniques to long-form, verbatim learning tasks and language learning, and something that Luke inspired me to revive on the other side of this interview. So for now, I give you Luke Ranieri of Polymathy and Scorpiomartianus and his many, many wise words about what it takes to learn massive amounts of language-related material for practical purposes and indeed the ineffable.
Hi, Anthony.
Luke, how are you doing? Let me try this. Quid agistu.
Bene, bene, me avio. E tu, Gidagis?
Bene. I think.
Hey.
Thanks so much for joining me, and really excited to see your recent Iliad 100. I think I remember it being called, and I immediately scooped that up because I wanted to see more of what you were saying. I can follow some of what you were teaching in the Latin, but wanted to get the actual text and was blown away by your thinking about applying memory to not just memorizing something like Iliad, but also just the ineffable, you say, the ineffable value of memorizing something.
Well, thanks for having me, Anthony, and thanks also for getting the audiobook. Yeah, the Iliad 100, just the catchiest name I could think of to describe an audiobook of the first 100 lines of the Iliad. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite as much, but yeah, I fell into this idea. I was taking a class in ancient Greek with a colleague, and he was saying how the way to, well, I was asked, wanted to know, because we were studying Homer, how do I asked him, figure out how to actually learn this in a way that I can continue doing? Because with his guidance, it was fine. And my ancient Greek is adequate to have a class that's in ancient Greek about the subject. But the ancient Greek that we learn as a something that we could actually communicate with or write in is based on prose authors of the classical and Koine periods. Whereas Homeric Greek is dramatically different in a lot of ways. It's this mixed dialect. It's not one dialect at all. It's this mixture of things from hundreds of years, going back into the Bronze Age, the Dark Ages of classical antiquity, and what this means is it's not very easy to study. No one could actually write original prose and certain maybe poetry, but not prose in Homeric Greek because it's this epic dialect is not one dialect. You see different forms of the same verb or noun that why are they different? Well, they're different because they've been preserved that way because of different rhapsodes from different islands of ancient Greece, different dialects mixing together, creating this mishmash of things that is nevertheless the foundation of Western literature. So it's so important, and it was this thing that was memorized by ancient students of Greece and of Rome, just almost like how say devout Christians might memorize biblical verses. It was just that important, that core to the literature and core to the culture. That and thus, if we want to be able to read literature, especially in the original and ancient Greek, something prose like Plato, well, we're going to inevitably get lines of Homer in there too. And confronted with this, I asked, well, what should we do? It's the name of this teacher, fantastic teacher, is Michael Kolp, goes by Kephalos in Greek. And Kephalos, he said that the way to the way that he ended up doing it was, since he was also not super into this poetry thing before, was that he just one day ended up opening up on his phone the beginning of the Iliad because he had some free time, and he just started to say it out loud and started to try to memorize it. And he found doing this over several months, memorizing the first 100 lines, that suddenly, instead of this being this weird, difficult to access alien thing, Homer became very familiar because he saw how Homer was reusing certain turns of phrase, certain speech, certain parts of speech and other things in a way that worked with the meter, which was above all the really important thing, and how all that co comes together and gets preserved in this rather amazing and magical way. And so, and that was really what got me into this wanting to memorize the beginning of the Iliad.
Mm. So how does it feel to have it in your head?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I'm still working on getting the first 100 lines down, but I can comfortably do the first ooh, at least 30 very comfortably, and then towards 50, not too bad. And I've seen all of them several times now, so I'm pretty sure by my own personal deadline, which is July 26th, I will have all 100 memorized, such I can recite them all with my eyes closed to prove that I'm not cheating. In some
You got to
video,
show
I'll
your
be
ears empty. That's the way they do it at the memory competitions. Make
good. Okay. Thank you for telling me that. I'll show that too on the video. Hey, my ears are empty. No one's feeding me the lines.
And then you
I'm
should
not
actually
listening.
there are people who have cheated at memory competitions where they've had uh some sort of device in their shoes that gives them Morse code.
Oh
So
my God.
don't wear any shoes either.
Oh, I have to learn Morse code just to cheat? That sounds terrible.
Oh, you'd be surprised the lengths that some people go to. It's bizarre.
Uh, wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, one of the things that um not truly original contribution that I may have made to this idea is to sing it, to sing the Iliad.
Mm.
And the reason I wanted to do that was mostly for the purpose of memorization. Um, although it is, of course, inspired by what the original epic was, which was never something written and down until the 8th century BC. It was something exclusively sung and thus changed as it was passed down through oral tradition for centuries and added to by different rhapsodes until, as far as we know, some guy named Homer, who was apparently blind, so he proves of the oral tradition part of it, I suppose. Someone listened to him recite both the Iliad and the Odyssey and wrote it all down. And then it became fixed, more or less entirely fixed, with very few variations in the epigraphic history. So the reason to sing it though that I really wanted was because ancient Greek is it's a pitch accent language. I don't know if you've ever heard of pitch accent languages.
Well, I've studied some Mandarin. I guess that counts because there's a whole lot of tones.
Absolutely. In fact, that's Mandarin is more complicated since it has four tones. Ancient Greek basically just has two, maybe three if you want, high and low,
Mm.
maybe a medium tone, but not nearly as complex as say Mandarin or Vietnamese or anything like that. Japanese, which is also a pitch accent language, is also simpler in that way, but is
Mm.
very different from our language. And importantly, though, it's also part of the orthography. It's written in there. The pitch accent in Greek, you have acutes and you have circumflexes and graves and all that. So what I wanted to do was to do essentially what the ancient rhapsodes did, which was to improvise a melody that is derived from the natural pitch accents of the language. So where there's a higher pitch, they would use a higher note, and where there's a lower pitch, it would be a lower note. And they would improvise things according to modes like Phrygian and all that. And I don't know any of that stuff, and that's
Mixolydian,
way too
Lydian,
complicated. That's
Phrygian,
right. Very good. Excellent.
Dorian.
There you go. You know better than me. And yeah, I don't know any of that very well, though I'm very
But you
interested in the
do a lot of
subject.
music, though.
Oh, I've
I
done all dabbling, yeah.
I was going to ask you if you have a musical background and if that, sort of lends itself because, I thought maybe you knew all the modes the way you were writing with the naturals and so forth in there. And I was like, man, this guy knows music.
Oh,
But
that's flattering. No, I did I just chorus and high school choir, university choir, a cappella groups. I led a couple, but I'm not a trained musician. I'm totally an amateur. I had a lot of fun doing the stuff I did. But yeah, I can, I can write sheet music, not very, well, but I can use a program to write some sheet music and read it a little bit. But yeah, the idea I had was I wanted to sing these lines in exactly the same melody every time, thinking about, well, the songs I know, new songs that I've known for only a few months, just pop songs or whatever, or really old songs I've known my whole life. The melodies stick with me, and usually I can just pick out the note just at random, some song I've known for decades. I can usually get the right pitch too, which isn't necessarily that important unless you're performing it, I guess. But I would remember the words and everything would all, together, even in foreign languages. So I was like, well, I would like to give this a melody that goes with the pitch accents, which is fundamentally important to the ancient Greek language and also happens to be to the orthography. Really memorize and internalize this text so it's crystallized forever, not add my own spoken pitch accent, which might be incorrect or variable, or because those things, accents in the spoken language can be suppressed or not as prominent in certain positions. I wanted everything to be equally prominent, pretty much how it is on the page. So I decided to, rather than do a complex melody like a Dorian or a Mixolydian or something like that, just elevate the pitch to by a third on the high pitch, and some bass note for the non-accented ones, and the ones that take the grave accent, something in between. So like the first line, which is "Me nae de te a," just those first
Mm-hmm.
little notes. So and I've always, for the past couple of months, I've been singing exactly the same notes of that line, so I can do "Me ni nae de te a pelea deo Achilleos," as if I was singing, on some song I learned when I was a kid, because I've
Okay.
been doing it the exact same way every time, rather than incorporate what we would do in a spoken poem, say the Aeneid by Virgil, or anything by Shakespeare. Those aren't meant to be songs. You could invent a melody,
Mm.
but that's a lot of work. And I wanted to just use the text itself, which has essentially musical component into it, and already worked into it, which is the pitch accent, and use that to guide exactly what I was doing. So it almost looks like sheet music, the text itself.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. There's many avenues to travel with that. Uh, one thing that comes to mind in my own experience is I memorize Sanskrit mantras, and I can usually find a musical example. They're usually sung, and they're often these condensations. So rather than memorizing a massive text, they'll make a smaller version. So Song Celestial is quite a nice one, where rather than memorizing all of the Bhagavad Gita, you memorize, I think, 68 lines or something like that. And that was the one where I couldn't find a song that I liked, so I made my own to help. So if you heard someone else pronounce it, they wouldn't be going Edam, Shriram, Kaunteya, Kushetram, Iti, Pidyate. But that was the kind of rhythm that I gave to it, and it's very not much of a melody, but the way they do it is quite different. But it helped me. But what I have, since I've done so much of this, do you can you now just desongify it? The lines that
Ooh,
you've memorized. Because I
I
can say
believe I
idam,
can.
shuriram, kaunteya, kushetram, iti, apidite, but I'm like
Mm.
always tempted to actually sing it because that's how I memorized it.
Yeah, me too. And which interestingly, whenever I now encounter a line of Homer, because now it stands out. It's like, oh, this is like, if I see it in a prose text, and it's clearly in Homeric, or at least the verses, it looks like that, epic style of, I don't know, it's just the way it's spelled, you can tell right away. And doesn't even have to be italicized or put into something. I notice it right away, and then I immediately like to recite it in this musical fashion,
Mm.
which I'd never done before. I was able to recite the meter, which is called dactylic hexameter, pretty comfortably, without any trouble. But now I really like to sing it too. If could I de-songify it? Me ni nae de te a peleado adeo Achilleus ulomenen Metivier. Yeah, I can't. Not as well. I'm struggling
It's
for
wild,
the moment, but I haven't tried. Sure, I
yeah,
could. I can write it down though from the memory. I
right.
can play it like a tape in my head and then transcribe it.
Yeah, I did a little bit with it, but I didn't want to try to do it in a show-offy way. And I was also thinking of some of your lessons that I've seen where it's just, stick with something, and then I was like, oh, I'm doing this thing with Sanskrit, so I'll just do it very lightly and not actually try to memorize it. But that was the first thing that I did, was you to try to write down men, and then I was thinking, well, is this exactly that way? Is it men like as in mind or something? And then I was like, well, I don't know, because it's of Peleus, son Achilles, single muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. Did I make
Oh.
my ears empty first? I don't know. But that's a particular translation, but I don't see
That's a good
mind.
translation.
I don't see mind in that translation, but I can't translate it myself. So anyway, but
Manning is wrath,
right. Oh well, that would be a
but
mindful
it
thing,
is
wouldn't it?
from related to the word mind
Mm,
in mania. So basically,
okay, yeah.
in kind of insanity. Your mind's going crazy. So you got that's the etymological connection.
Right, right. Okay. Well, anyway, that's another sort of level of memory hook in a way. But yeah, I didn't think wrath, mind, yeah, mania. Beautiful, beautiful how it works.
Yeah, and also that was it Manu in Sanskrit and man in English.
Yeah, there's different versions of it in Sanskrit for sure, but yeah, there's Mano Bujahankara Chitani
Hmm.
Naham. Lots of verses start with that for sure, and that's mind. Um, well, in terms of the reason that you are in this whole game in the first place, I mean, I kind of don't understand how it all works because you've got seems like three channels, or maybe it's just two, but I don't know. There's all these channels, and you've got all this time in the world to be, quizzing people in everywhere from Rome to Times Square about their ancient language skills. And it's like, where do you have the time to actually be, giving talks and taking a course just, because it would be cool to maybe read some Homeric references in Plato? Like, how do you pull it all off and give
Well, that's
advice?
very flattering. I don't I feel like I'm so far behind in all of my channels and the things I do and audiobooks and all that. I guess because I've made many videos in different places, it gives this sense of ubiquitousness. But I'm very flattered to hear that because I feel like I'm behind in everything I try to do. But yeah, I mean, it's making videos, making audiobooks is an absolute um, joy because I ended up, yeah, falling into this subject, Latin and ancient Greek in particular. Now working on Coptic, slow going there, not a lot of great materials. And just finding that it's amazing. I really like modern languages. I could speak Italian comfortably, and I've studied many others, but these ancient languages have enormous value that I don't think can be understated. For example, most of what we think of as history, so say the chronology of events in Europe, obviously, and in particular, from obviously from antiquity, but all of the Middle Ages and almost all of the Renaissance, and really up to the 19th century, the vast majority is written in Latin, and only like 1%, maybe two, has been translated of everything written in Latin. So that means we're dependent on certain facts and chronology. Think of like it's important to if you're studying a time in history, could be, the succession of a king or even some ancient war between France and England and so forth. And there are letters and historical documents and little things that could give a clue that, oh no, that battle was actually here, or the king was really here, or something that could have been really important or interesting, but all of that's written in Latin.
Mm,
So the only people who have access to that are people who can read Latin. So that's a really good reason, I would say, to learn the language. And I found that to be constantly an inspiration. It's not the reason I started to learn Latin, but it's the reason that I find it so important. People are interested in utility. How does this serve
mm,
the utilitarian need of some sort. But it's really, I mean, the best analogy I think for learning an ancient language like Latin or ancient Greek is as much as one learns a musical instrument. Learn to play the violin or the piano. Are you going to go and get money to do that professionally? And I don't know, the New York Symphony? I hope so. That'd be great, but probably not. Probably you're
right.
doing it because it's edifying, because it introduces you to this whole world of culture where you can listen to a symphony, you can listen to music, you can hear the composition, even just used in some film, and appreciate at a much deeper level than the layman about when it comes to that stuff. So when I really get inspired, it's when I now it's with the Iliad more recently, where just thinking about how Agamemnon in the very beginning of the story, it starts off great, by the way. I had no idea how interesting it was. I never really read it.
Oh, it's
I do
deep.
kind of, you're just kind of inundated with the myths and the legends and Agamemnon and Achilles, and we probably all seen that movie Troy, and if we had taste, we hated it, and we don't get it. Just everybody likes the film. It's fine. You can like whatever you want, but just thinking of how Agamemnon just said "Me seguiron koilesinego." It is just like you just so like you get out of here. How you groveled to me and you want your daughter back? Well, how about you get the heck out of here before I kill you because your daughter's gonna be in my bedchamber until she's an old woman. like that's like the 20th or 30th line. That's like it's really early in this in the beginning of it. And it's like,
Yeah.
whoa, like this is some real, intense, ooh, kind of stuff. Of course, the consequence of that is that the priest then prays to Apollo, and Apollo comes and wreaks havoc on the Greeks. So it's filled with all this, big epic legendary stuff, but really it's filled with highly relatable dramatic action. That surprised me about the Iliad in particular. And it's something I would not have appreciated just trying to read it in English, partially because the meter, the music that's beyond not my singing of it, but the music of the rhythm and the words being used do convey that. And that's also a reason why I wanted to memorize it because as my colleague Kefalos was telling me, it's just it's in a way I perceived as someone who can read somewhat comfortably the classical Attic, classical Greek without a huge amount of trouble. Whereas home Mercury was just so alien to me, I didn't even want to touch it. Now that I've memorized it, now I see, oh, this word isn't that alien at all. Yeah, it has a different form, but I get it. I know what this is. This is just like this thing. And now all kinds of, it's so interesting to see my own memory um, of earlier words that I had and vocabulary and phrases that I'd seen before tell me, oh, that's what this is. I don't even have to look up the word. Instead, if I had studied in a more traditional way, I would have probably gone and tried to understand word for word, what is this? What is this? What is this? And maybe it wouldn't even have stuck because you learn one vocabulary word and then another. It doesn't work as well. But this way, because I've already pre-recorded it into my brain, I can play it back and that the element of familiarity with the text, the words, the letters themselves, that's all taken care of. Then I
Mm.
can concentrate on meaning and even performance.
Right, right. Yeah, there's much to go on there. I mean, this is one of the arguments in music is learn your modes because if you go, oh, Eleanor Rigby, that's Dorian. Okay, so now you hear some other thing that's like that, and then your fingers are on the fretboard and you're already working it out much, much faster because you have some understanding of like, oh, you know, whatever you're in, right? So F Locrian or something like this, like all these fancy, they sound bizarre words, but if you can work that out in your mind, you hear it, the echo. It's kind of like that. I think I've been advocating the memorization of stuff, whether you know it or not, for a long time. Because in German, that was one of the big boosts for me. Was okay, Marlene Dietrich, that song's amazing, and then I memorize it, and then all of a sudden, I don't want to exaggerate it. I was going to say all of a sudden a door bursts open, but it's more like the door goes like this and more light comes into the room and then it's like the next
Mm.
song and then a little more light and as you keep reading and hearing and talking and so forth even a bit dated as Marlene Dietrich is in German but also dare I say this in these tempestuous times but even memorizing a bit of Rammstein it's just like this kind of stuff just brings gravitas to your own experience of the language and then that idea that I don't have this experience in the Iliad, but I have it with memorizing Bhagavad Gita. There's like, okay, so Arjuna has this emotion or whatever reaction to whatever is being said here, but when you know it in the Sanskrit, then it's just like, oh my God, like it
Mm.
really hits you in some ineffable way, I guess, but also in a realistic way because it is the tongue, it's like knowing some Shakespeare or something like that because there is a difference in having it inside your skin. Um,
Mm.
and
That's
knowing
true.
like Shakespearean language is not our language actually. It's got its own logic rhythm. I don't know
Mm.
quite what word to say, but it's a
Mm.
contact, a lived thing.
That's true. And also too, it's so good, so important what you're doing on your channel on the podcast because learning things by rote is something that has become much less popular in pedagogy for, I say, a century or so. I'd say from the end of World War II. That changed a lot of things. Perhaps I'd say maybe coincidentally also that's when studies of the classics like Latin and Greek, there became less and less interest in those things. Um, also the university system became more open to kind of everybody, and instead of it just being a small elite, and thus Latin and Greek, which was for, had this elitist connotation in the past. Well, that's because they were being studied there, and you don't need to learn Latin and Greek to be a carpenter to do something, of value.
Mm.
So really important because we need all those trades too. So, but it's interesting how memorization as an educational tool has been, certainly in the United States, it's more like, critical thinking, learn to think, learn to find the information, learn how to use the internet. Even when I was, 'cause I was in middle school when the internet came to the library, and it's like, wow, this is amazing. I could look up all kinds of facts and things right there. And so teaching us to know how to use the tools was the key. That's still critical. Now we have, ChatGPT and other large language models, dare I say, artificial intelligence
Is
of
it really language, do you think?
large language models.
Yeah. Is it really
Um,
language?
it's well, I guess, well, what they do is they are able to essentially scour all the information that's given to them. In the case of ChatGPT, a lot of the text written about all kinds of subjects that can be accessed by Google, at least 4 years ago,
Mm.
as I understand how the system works, and then to be able to predict based on that how to create the next thing. Actually, Google Translate was doing that for a long time. It's just doing it in a more sophisticated way because there's a lot more data that goes into it. So the more data that goes into it, the more it can produce something, but it's not really what I would consider to be intelligence or language usage in the way that we seem to.
Mm.
But yeah, but I'm no expert in neither neurology nor the AI. But I just know it's not very good at Latin and Greek yet. Latin and ancient Greek, that modern Greek is fine. Modern languages, there's so much more input available.
Mm.
Um, when it comes to the importance of memorizing things, for example, say memorizing uh, a declension in Latin, which is just a paradigm for how the noun changes forms, or a verb conjugation. The value and importance of doing that has been reduced a lot. And have you done any memorization of certain paradigms or things like that, grammar-wise, in your
You mean
German
like amo,
studies?
amas, amat, amamos, amatis, amat? I
Yep,
might have missed one there.
very good. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I had
yeah,
to in university, and uh, I've done it, but not to your degree, that's for sure. But and in German, I had to know it much more directly, be able to conjugate, and some crazy stuff going on in there.
yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's when we learn languages, when it comes to that grammatical, the nuts and bolts of the language, often, more and more often, rote memorization has been discouraged. And I see the point of view, and I mostly share it when it comes to this. We're talking about comprehensible input methods of second language acquisition. That
Mm,
is based on Stephen Krashen's theory, which I think is well observed and is reasonable, that you can only learn something in a language if you understand it. That's almost a tautology, but it was kind of revolutionary in the 70s and the 80s when he was first writing about it. You have to understand something, like if it's Rammstein, ich hasse dich, yeah, that kind of thing. That you have to know what that means ultimately to get the message. You have to get the message to learn it. And thus there's a kind of incremental, one way to do it is incrementally teach you um das Buch, hier habe ich ein Buch, or whatever in German. Here I have a book, that kind of thing. And then you see it, and through a lot of other stimuli, you acquire the language piece by piece in a way that you can remember it much better, because it's always about remembering. We have to remember vocabulary and phrases and things like that, ideally through some kind of experience which has meaning, like a story if we're reading, or through interactions with people. I remember some of the first commands in ancient Greek because I saw a video of a famous teacher, Christoph Rico, who teaches in ancient Greek. He was commanding the students on their first day, stand up and sit down, katison, and I don't know, treche, run, all these th different things. He was saying all this stuff, and I remember it vividly, and even his accent, how he said them. And that's just kind of fused in my mind because just seeing that happen was exciting and memorable. That said, is it of value to actually memorize paradigms? I came to when I started learning Latin was back in '05. Oh my gosh, 19 years. I've been studying Latin. I'm not done. You're never done learning a language, certainly not Latin. And that's the joy of it, even when you get relatively good at it. When I started, I found some random web page by Professor Dowling, and he's just like, "This is the Dowling method," he wrote, and he made it very clear that the problem with Latin is you can spend, I think 6 years, I think he wrote it, you can spend 6 years studying it and still not be able to read a single sentence. And he demonstrated here, actually a little comic book of like Julius Caesar from the Gallic Wars or something, and it's this long sentence of something he said right before going into battle about, it was a very courageous, very famous phrase. But I had at that point, I'd taken a semester, yeah, I'd taken a semester of Latin myself. I thought, yeah, that's totally obscure. And I felt like if I had seen this equivalent in Italian, which I had already had a semester of Italian at that point, I would have been able to understand it. And one of the issues there that he talked about, which is probably the more fundamental issue, is if you're learning in the traditional method of, here's some grammar rules and here's some stuff to translate, that you will learn some things about the language and you may even retain some vocabulary, but you won't necessarily internalize the language in the same way that you would in a modern language class. Why? Because in the modern language class, you're being spoken to in the language, and very often, very early, especially the good teachers, they will be teaching you the nominative and the genitive in German. They'll be teaching you those cases in German. Or if it's or Italian, they'll be talking about the coniugazione di questo verbo, the conjugation of this verb or that. They'll be saying all these things in a way. So when you, which is amazing, and this interesting fact that has been discovered through second language acquisition studies, that if you learn about grammar, a rather dry subject, and maybe not the best sort of comprehensible input, still you will retain that grammar much better if you learn it in the language
Mm.
when it's being taught to you, which is it is so interesting because if you're being taught it in your native language or some other working language, you won't retain it as well, which is crazy, but apparently it's true. And I found it to be true as well with Latin and ancient Greek and Italian and Japanese and other things. It's really helpful. Um, and when it comes then to memorizing things, this Professor Dowling, he said that what you should do is instead of mixing these things of learning to translate some random quotes of Cicero and Caesar and Ovid or and a list of grammar rules, just take the most important part of the grammar, which is the highly inflected system of nouns and verbs, all the conjugation of verbs, all the different forms of the noun, like like rosa, rosai, rosai, rosam, rosa, 5 forms for the word rose in the singular. That's kind of daunting. Memorize it though, he said. Mem and By writing it down and then to such that you could write it down any paradigm of the basic, the 5 basic declensions, which is what they're called for nouns, and the 4 regular conjugations of verbs, and and the irregular ones, which is very little irregular stuff in Latin, which is to its credit, good old Romans and standardization. And you'll be able to then, once you do that, start with the book Familia Romana, which is from the Lingua Latina series by Hans Warburg, which is a story. It's a novella that's written in Latin, and then you read that, but you'll already know all of this morphology. These endings will be like, why is it, Rosa, was it Marchi now instead of Marcus? What does Marchi mean?
Mm.
You might be confused by that, and maybe the context wouldn't be enough to help you know. But if you learned before in this Dowling method of rote memorization of the case system that Marchi is the genitive case. This is possession. It means of Marcus. Oh, so pater Marchi doesn't confuse me at all why it's changed. I'm not thrown by that at all. So his idea was basically memorize these morphology elements, and then you'll be prepared for everything in Latin. I did that, and I found it profoundly successful. And I found insofar as I've successfully memorized ancient Greek, which is far vaster in morphological variety, and I'm always surprised almost every day by some irregular form that I should have known. that has also more enormously helped there because it helps. What it I think it does is helps to reduce the mystery. But um, I don't know if that's something that you've tackled or dealt with in your field. This kind of memorization, rote memorization of dry subject matter like grammatical paradigms.
Well, I'm fascinated with all kinds of ways of getting things into one's head, and there's certainly, in my view, mnemonic means technique, so rote would fall under mnemonics. But I sometimes
Mm.
distort reality, so it's the way I like it rather than the way it is. But that seems to me valid. That if mnemonic means technique, rote is a technique. So why wouldn't and it's a memory technique. So why wouldn't we call it a mnemonic technique? Um, I think really, I mean, one thing that I find interesting about your work very much is that you just with songs and music and going out and talking to people and dressing up and like all these kinds of things. What what it is and what the difference in my mind is the difference between repetition by rote and creative repetition. That seems to me where the money falls, right?
What do
Because
you mean by creative repetition?
well, I don't know what you're doing in your mind, but you might have something that goes on when you put on a suit, right? That has a framing effect. You also, seem to have a lot of confidence, and that confidence, may come from different ways, but I'm going to do this. Dowling, I think he said,
Hmm.
he's going to say, do this, so I'm going to do that, right? So these are like mental frameworks. These are already creative in their genesis, so to speak. So when I observe things, those are the kinds of things that I observe, and I wonder, like, how could others model that? Because there's a strategy there, even if it's unconscious or subconscious or whatever word we want to use. The other thing too that comes to mind, it's a little bit off of what we were just talking about, but when you were talking about, um, genitive and how that's going to appear in this or that language, I think this is just my thinking observation, having studied language in Europe with Europeans from other parts of Europe. The English speakers, native speakers, always really struggle with this stuff. And I thought maybe it's because they have cases in ways that we don't, right? It's already reflected there. So they're picking this stuff up faster because it's not like I have to now sit there and go, okay, so that's masculine and that's feminine and that's neuter and all this sort of stuff. And it's like this additional baggage on top of baggage. Whereas, and this is just a guess, but if you already have and especially I was in class with a lot of Russians, so they're like case crazy, and it just seemed to like make more sense to them, and they just seemed to get it. So I've had that kind of thing of learning the grammar in German, but at the same time there was still a kind of zone of confusion and frustration, and I had to find my inner confidence and inner frame in order to be like, how am I going to get through this? And I didn't do a Picard kind of thing, but that would have helped actually, to think of Picard in a situation. And I'm just gonna because I'm thinking of your video where you're talking about Picard, having to observe, and I have this teacher like Schauenvermal every day, and it's like, what the heck is this guy saying? Like what?
Schauenvermalt. Yeah, I love my favorite. Yeah.
But anyway, like I didn't at that time know to like create and I don't know that you're doing that, but it's just like a thing that I observed. But when I think of Luca with his stuff, Ollie, they all seem to have like this real in the genesis of it, a creative thing that they're doing, as opposed to this now must be earned through mindless repetition. I just don't see it in you
Mm.
guys. Uh,
That
uh,
well that's really boy it's I think it's a very high compliment. Thanks. I can reflect a little bit on about on what I do. Say the Dowling method, for example. I realized upon reflection that it was some maybe 4 years ago, I think, when I wanted to talk about it in a video, and I realized I actually didn't do the Dowling method. I added something to it, which was really helpful to me, which was as I was reciting them, I was also saying them all out loud. And I was also counting some, because Dowling says you should write them, I think he said 200 times or 80 times. I'm trying to remember how many he said. I decided to default, I think it was 200. Yeah, I think I defaulted towards 200 for everything. So just say if you'd repeat something 80 times, that was my a German teacher said 80 times. I remember now. This was back in my middle school. German teacher said, yeah, 80 times. And then but Dowling said 200 times. So I just felt for as many as I could. But I counted some of the repetitions as if I did them verbally. And I was keeping track of them, like with like just counting like little ticks. If I was writing, rosa, 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 and so forth, doing that, how many times I was doing that. And once it was memorized such that I could, for example, if I want to memorize that pattern, and if you're not familiar with those of you out there listening, if you're not familiar with these declension things, think of say conjugation of a verb in say Spanish, which you might know, like canto, cantas, canta, cantamos, cantáis, cantan. You have to memorize that verb. Okay, well then, if you're able to write that down, try to like, kind of look away and maybe only peek, and then eventually you can turn the page over and it's blank, and you can write from memory, and then like okay, it's in short-term memory. That's the trick. And then you can check that with space repetition, by just spacing it out some days later, at the very least. But what I was doing is I was saying them aloud very often. I was saying them aloud and seeing it in my mind, often seeing my own handwriting, and using the auditory part of that. So I could just, as you did, you were able to rattle off beautifully a second ago the amo amas amat, amamos amatis amant.
Mm.
That's basically the same conjugation as the Spanish. I said a second ago. And it has an auditory component like music, which is able just to stick in memory in an effective way. And well, therefore, I realized that this thing I was doing was reasonably unique, and then maybe having an auditory component could really help people. So I adapted the Dowling method into something that I ended up calling the Ranieri Dowling method, um, to somewhat whimsically name it after myself, along with the great Dowling, in the sense, and by making it an audiobook where you have all the declensions and conjugations recited, so that you could listen to that in the car, which is easy. You could actively engage with it by repeating after the audio recording much as much as you could write by hand. So you incorporate more than one language learning discipline at the same time, and apparently it's been very effective, and people have liked it a lot, which is good. And I
Mm.
found it very effective for myself. So that's, I suppose, a creative thing that how I personalized someone else's technique and made it more useful for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say that the only thing that mnemonics brings to the game, and it's a big only really for people who glom onto it, is and writing is an important part of it. But in order to make it just a little faster, if not a lot faster in some cases, if you're going to have a mus in it, then why not Mickey Mouse? And if it's going to be a Tis, then why not Tess of the Dubervilles? And if it's going to be an int, then why not Ant-Man? Like those are the things that mnemonics bring to it. The catch is, do you know Mickey Mouse, or do you know a moose, or do you know Elon Musk, and can you rattle all that off? And for years, I was quite surprised about how people struggle with this. Like they just can't. I can't think of Ant Man as fast as you can. And I'm like, really, why not? Like, but somebody told me, Richard Rubin, not Rick Rubin, but Richard Rubin, a different guy. He was on the podcast, and he said actually there was a whole generation in the United States. I don't know the date range, and I don't even know if it's true, but it seems like a compelling thesis because it just shocks me the 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 struggles that I've seen since the internet rose up in terms of mental rotation and mental combination. And he said there's actually been an entire generation that had no phonics in training. They like took phonics out of reading, which I don't distinctly remember whether I had phonics in reading or not, but it totally makes sense.
Mm.
I basically remember sounding things out and seeing like A and B and C like paired with shapes that were then somehow phonically related to the shapes in different ways. So I wonder if that's part of the struggle with just overall that a lot of people are seeing. Um,
Mm.
anyway, it's
Oh,
his thesis.
yeah. Well, that's a really interesting observation. I'd like to talk about the phonics part because that's an interesting question. You reminded me of something that was highly mnemonic in my studies, which was how to remember the kanji. There was a book written by Heisig called
I say,
Remembering the
yeah.
Kanji.
Mm.
And I've actually haven't made a video about it yet, but I wanted to for a lot of years because it is amazing. When I was stationed in Japan and I was there, I barely really know any Japanese, but I wanted to learn the language and realized well, I have to learn the writing system. Well, Japanese has three, kind of four. We'll just say three. And the most important one, really, are the kanji, which are just Chinese characters.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have to know 2,000 of them
The Hansa
to
gone
read.
wild.
Yeah. So you have to know 2,000 of these characters. You have to know like 5,000 to read Chinese, just 2,000 for Japanese. Not so bad. You have to know all of these, but to read anything, unless it's just been dumbed down for a learner. Now, there's nothing wrong with being able to read the basic, phonetic elements, but ultimately, if you want to go out into the world and read a sign
Mm.
directing you somewhere, you have to be able to read these darn kanji. Well, how do you do that? And his technique, which was tremendously useful and worked really well for me, which was to teach you, okay, here's um, the kanji in a traditional sense is broken up to things called radicals. There's more fundamental pieces that have an etymology in a visual sense. They come from different, a more ideographic things that look more like hieroglyphs and a much more ancient version of Chinese. And you can break up the kanji, the Chinese character, that way. But a better way is to break up elements that you can distinctly recognize. And then whenever you see them together, like say you learn the sun. It's just looks like a box and it has a line through it. Just think of the ancient symbol for the sun, say the west, the more astrological symbol, which is a circle with a dot, but it's been just kind of smeared into a box and a line. Okay, so you got
Mm.
sun. You can visualize that. And then you see three of them together. Well, this kanji has a different meaning, which is sparkle. And this kind of combining of things together, eventually you can take these building blocks, and as you build, like, why are there three suns together? Well, you could imagine holding a diamond and seeing three faces that are reflecting off of it. But for yet more complicated kanji, it's really important he demonstrated to make up a story, to go through the effort I would use scenes from The Simpsons or the
Mm.
Simpsons characters or change the scenes because I grew up with The Simpsons and I remember very vividly so many of the scenes and events and quotes and all. Like it's all very well ingrained in my head, like a memory palace or something. You're using a familiar territory and you're mapping things onto it. And it worked amazingly. In a matter of months, I was able to learn all the kanji, and then I was able to read virtually anything. In fact, it was weird. I was able to read things, but not have any idea how they were pronounced because
Right,
the meaning and the
right.
pronunciation are not related. And sometimes they can have more than one pronunciation. In fact, mo almost every single one of them do these kanji because they have a pronunciation that's associated with the Chinese character from the Chinese pronunciation of some dialect that's probably dead now, and then also a pronunciation in Japanese, and sometimes two or three or four of each. And so that the wrong way, Isaac said, to learn kanji is the way that most people do, which is you learn how to write it in a visual and mechanical motion with your hand and your eye. Very difficult to do. It's like memorizing a shape of a cloud or a kaleidoscope. And then, which, that's a fun memory challenge, but it's
Well, I
not the,
laugh because I was the commentator at the 2023 Pan American Open Memory Competition, and so they had a surprise round. And what they did is they threw up cloud formations, and they had
oh my God.
how many cloud formations can you memorize in 2 minutes? And Naoki was the competitor from Japan, and Johannes Malo was asking me while Alex Mullen and Naoki are memorizing this. And he said, "How do you think they're going to do it?" And I said, "Oh, probably 00 to 99 PAO. I mean, how else?" Anyway, we asked them later, and that's exactly what they were doing. And then I tried out my very limited Japanese with Naoki, and I said "Mutsukashi kunai," which is something like it's not that difficult. Not that difficult, is it?
いいね。
But
よくしましたよ. Very well done.
domo arigato gomaisu. I really don't know Japanese, but in any case, um,
大丈夫ですよ. That's okay.
but the Heisek thing is kind of an illustration of the division, because if you read the reviews of any of his books, really, because he's got a bunch, it's actually almost, I think I did a count one time. It's like 50-50. People are like, wow, this is amazing. And other people are like, I can't figure this out. Why this would be
Mm.
useful and a good use of time. And so I
They
don't know
didn't
if that
trust
has
it.
to do with, I don't know if that has to do with the phonology thesis of Richard Rubin, but in my mind, part of it is that Heisig, first of all, he doesn't have a memory palace component. And then the other thing is there's the assumption that you would ever make the association that he does, you know. So the
Mm.
sun coming down over a tree or something like that, like sure, but maybe I see a mouth that is
Well,
um,
good, he
doing
says.
dental floss.
He's
Yes, that's true.
absolutely. He says invent your own. He's just using his because he finds that he uses a lot of biblical analogies
Mm,
because that's his work is primarily in religion.
that's true.
Excuse me.
I guess
Yeah.
it's not really a complaint that he doesn't say that, but it's kind of then lost and it comes back in
Mm.
my memory anyway. And the other thing is I know it's not a criticism. It's just this is the thing that it's one of the things that inspired my work is like how do we think mnemonically, um, so that you have art of combination because ars combinatoria is a thing and it was very important in the times that or read well in, and you could probably
Mm.
read Bruno on Ramon Lull very well and figure out better than I have what the heck's going on there. But the memory wheel and the combinations that you generate in order to have deeply personal associations. That was a thing. It had a name, Ars Combinatoria, and it went with
Mm.
Memoria Verborum and Memoria Rerum, and
Mm.
not pronouncing that probably right, but
Beautifully.
there's other ones. Memoria, no, Auditorium. Is that right? Did I already say that one?
Hmm. Hmm.
They like really got into the granular detail of like how are we going to make this work? And to this day, people argue about it. Did he mean by rerum that it was like things, or did he mean the gist of things? Now, I think that this is Brad Wardine, by the way. I think that what he meant was the gist of things in that particular case, and auditorium or verborum is more like the
Mm.
verbatim. So anyway, I wonder the extent to which these guys actually knew languages as well as we think they did in the old times, and that a lot of the wonderful debates and discussions and disagreements came from like quote unquote, just being good enough at certain things as
Mm.
they're wandering around Europe. I don't know, but they thought long and hard about how to memorize real quick. Uh, so,
Mm.
and it was
Well,
usually
I
deeply personal.
yeah, well, you in your videos, and I've only seen a small number of your catalog, but I'm just intrigued and amazed and thinking about how these people in the Middle Ages and of Renaissance, of course, but antiquity, how they were memorizing things to such an extent. That's why I thought, gosh, can surely, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, so the Greek wasn't even their native language, were memorizing huge tracts of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Of course, they started
Mm,
much younger. It's helpful to be younger, I guess, when you're memorizing things. But
that's
they
true.
they did it. And then they continued through through later in their life to memorize whole books, like whole dialogues of Plato and things like that. Um, and so I figured, well, I can, memorize 100 lines in 100 days. It shouldn't be that hard.
Yeah.
It's been somewhat challenging, but I have noticed my memory improving, which is interesting. I feel like it's comparable to a muscle and like a skill and there's so many skills to learn as you demonstrate so well on your channel and on the podcast. There's so many different things you can do to memorize things that might work better for you that you could memorize all kinds of things and then you carry it with you. What's been interesting to me, and I wanted to pick your brain on a little bit, is the memorization of a lot of stuff, or even verbatim memorization of long text. And I saw a video where you said like, why would you do that? Why would you memorize a whole book
as
when
I
you don't have to?
as I work
Find
on
the
it
important
myself.
information. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's also, tedious to memorize a novel. If you're going to want to memorize something, it
Mm,
should be something really important or valuable. And I think memorizing, Sanskrit or Greek poetry or even Shakespeare for sure, something that's a poem. There's something because a poet puts so much effort into
mm.
the limitations of the meter that it's a way to ingest, almost like a beautifully put together plate of food, or made by like a master chef, or instead of just some fast food or something, which might be a lot of prose, or some trashy novel or something. But if you have something that you really would want to memorize a lot of, I wondered how you would do it.
Mm.
And I've also just I've n never really done a memory palace before, and I was really intrigued by your talking about imaginary memory palaces because I'm almost afraid to use my house because it only has has like maybe 10 rooms,
Oh, you
and
could
then
do
what do
so
you
much.
does it overlap? Could somebody let me I have this question for you
Well,
first,
I
and
didn't mean
I'm sorry this is too irrelevant because
no,
you
no,
already talked
no.
about this extensively, but I just want to know, are you afraid of overwriting using the
No.
same space?
Never, never, never. No, no fear. We got to get our inner Picard here. Although Picard, of course, is capable of feeling fear. But wir atmen tief ohne Angst, I think we can say in German. We breathe deeply without fear. Um, I don't know if that's a saying. I've picked that up somewhere. But uh, I want to pick your brain later too. But let's dive into that. I've just shot a video and I'm about to edit like an hour video at least about imaginary memory palaces and all my experiments with them. And I'm sure I will do more in the future. But in terms of overlap and all this sort of stuff, there's so many different ways to think about this. And often, I think you would probably know this as a teacher. Sometimes you have to choose to just talk about it directly, and other times you can noodle all over the place and get into crash in this and study that, and like. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like Mutsu Cash. Oh, sorry, that's the other one. Genshi Genbutsu. Go to the real place, do the real thing. So the way to do it is take that 10 rooms that you've got and just do it, right? And then see what happens when things overlap, because it might not be the bad thing that you think. So
Hmm.
I've memorized a lot of stuff, right? And I never have this problem. And one of the things that is musical and beautiful and magical about it is recursion. So let me try to think about a way to describe recursion. Well, I sort of did already because I haven't memorized, I haven't committed it to memory, the opening of the Iliad in Greek, although I have it in English, a particular translation, which is of Peleus, son Achilles, single muse, the vengeance deep and deadly whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. But that I asked you, I was like, does the men thing have to do with mind? And because I had this intuition about it. Well, that's recursion, right? That
Hmm.
already makes that I already remembered that somehow that line starts with an MEN or MA, like some MN thing in the beginning. I instantly remembered it because I had this thought. That's recursion. Now, do I have to think about where in one of my memory palaces is of Peleus on Achilles, sing O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly whence to Greece? Well, I could go in there and go, right beside Muse would be a great place to have another line. But that's not going to be a good idea for if I take on the first 100 lines of Iliad. That'd be dumb. What would be better is if I think, okay, so it starts with M. Who do I know or what do I know that also starts with M, right? So, and I was thinking of this yesterday, and I was like, well, I could use my friend Mike's place, uh, or it might be a concert hall where I have a really fond memory of a musician with a microphone, because M and M, right? This is the way I do it. Is I always try to think, what is this thing? Sanskrit, there's Upadesa Sharam. It starts with U, but I put it in Kelvin Grove because it starts Karturagnia Praputaplam. So it's K. So it's in Kelvin Grove, very specifically. My TEDx talk is in that memory palace. Also, the Ripu Gita extracts are in there. So I reused it.
Hmm.
But here's where we get into the weeds about it all. My first advice is Genshi Genbutsu. Just go and do it. Don't worry about all the zillion things that can happen because recursion will happen. You will think, oh, that connects to this. And oh my God, all of a sudden this connects to that. And like da da da. And I can memorize that. And like it's amazing. It is the ineffable, really. It's where you start to really change your relationship to what memory is. But if I was going to memorize this, I would start with a new memory palace, the Iliad, in Greek, and I would also try to mix it up. So I'd have one memory palace for, say, the first 100 lines or whatever, and then I would eyeball it. Is that going to be enough space? I would draw it out just like this. It's simple.
Hmm.
I mean, drawing is a word that apparently scares people. So what I really mean, if you're listening to this, is a chicken scratch of a location. right? And so
Yeah.
one, two, three. And I have many of these drawings. Now, it has to do with something you mentioned, the power of writing from memory, right? So a true memory palace is what you remember of the location, not what you're going to memorize of it. So if I'm later thinking, man, this information starts with L, I talked with Luke. I only saw this little space here, but he had some Greek words there on the right side of my memory, and then he had an air conditioner on the left. So that's a little bit, and this stuff starts with L. Um, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I have memorized that starts with L at the moment, but whatever might be there, right? And I would just draw it out quickly, and then that would be part one, and that would be our station one. Or you can help me with this actually, because I think that you can say both loci and loci, but people like to correct me all the time that it's one or the other, and that it should be loci or loci. And it's just like, I want to ask you about pronunciation later,
I'd
but
be happy to tell you about that. Sure.
at the end of the day, I call them stations. So
Uh-huh.
I would just fix it there. And then later, if you let's say you get book one done, and then I don't know, maybe you're doing the Nicoya or something in the Odyssey, and you think, oh, I want to memorize this in English. Then went down to the ship, set keel to sail, or whatever it is, set keel to breakers and forth on the godless sea. Like all this sort of stuff. If you want to add it to a memory palace, just see what happens. Just try it.
Mm.
There is ghosting. It's called ghosting sometimes, where one will interfere with the other. But my
Mhm.
preference is skip it. Don't even get into the issue. Always new memory palaces. Always, always, always. And we can go down the rabbit hole of how the Giordano Bruno's infinite memory palace technique works, as I understand it, because it may not be
Mm.
the way that it actually is. But as I understand it, or as I formulate it, no one runs out of space, right? Megaston
Okay.
topos hapantagar kori. Space is ultimate because it contains all things. Maybe not the right translation, but that's the way I understand it. It's just
Wow.
not possible. No one runs out of space. No one has
Okay.
problems. There are no objections to the memory palace technique. None. I put my foot down on it. It's just ridiculous to make objections of it. There's one objection, and it is this. And it's not really an objection. I still don't accept it, but I accept that people have it. Is that some people don't want weird images in their minds. But
And you
usually
talked
these
about that in one of
people,
your videos. They're helpful.
usually these
They're weird.
people usually these people, they actually want to memorize weird stuff. And I had this the other day. This guy was like, I want to memorize this thing. And I totally respect him, but I gave him my honest answer. I'm like, dude, this mantra that you want to memorize, it talks about killing demons. You're going to memorize God and pray to a God to kill demons, and you want to avoid violence? Hello? Earth to
Mm.
computer. You remember Star Trek 4? Earth, hello, computer. You like it just doesn't. I don't mean to dismiss anybody or sound arrogant, and I know that it does, but at the same time, like it just doesn't make sense to me. So it is the
Mm.
only true objection, but I kind of dismiss it because if we're gonna live in the world, we're gonna encounter stuff we don't like, which is a beautiful thing to memorize. It's the 50th verse of the Atma Bodha, which is I'll just do it in English because it might take me a second to catch it back here. It is those who manage to sail past the great like dislike monster will arrive at the sea of tranquility, something like that.
Mm.
I'm not sure why it's evading me the actual Sanskrit, but it's got Moharnavam in it anyway. The phrase,
Mm.
and it that's moho is like ocean of chaos kind of thing, and
Mm.
if you pass through the great like dislike monster, it's a reference to something. It'll come to me
Mm.
later. The full thing. It
Yeah.
ends Ramo Varajate. Anyway, these memory blips happen sometimes, but that's what I always suggest to people. If you're really gonna do this, get comfortable with unusual images because they're your best friend, and get comfortable
Yeah.
with things blurring with each other. Get comfortable with forgetting. Get
Mm.
comfortable with all kinds of things because actually the forgetting is what will help you the most. You'll go, oh, like why is it that that's a little choppy? And it's like, well, you haven't recited it for a while.
You refine the technique.
Yeah, and you refine and
Yeah.
you get better. And it's a Zeno's paradox in a way. Like you're just never going to have perfect memory. It's not going to happen. Um,
Right.
unless you have highly superior autobiographical memory. But I have suspicions about that, and I always notice strange things about the corporate television interviews that people make with people who have highly superior autobiographical memory. And I have a feeling that those interviews would not go quite the same way we see on television if I was
Mm.
the interviewer, if you know what I mean. But anyway, I own it. I make a lot of mistakes, and I encourage others to do that. But draw the memory palaces, make it
Hmm.
based on memory, and then use the wildest, craziest images that you can come up with and try to get some sort of correspondence between sound and meaning whenever you can.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, I've I started my first memory palace inspired by you actually yesterday, just using my garden instead, because I broke up the first 100 lines of the Iliad into 14 passages, 14 little scenes that I ended up giving them slightly different melodies and things like that and the audiobook so I could remember them more easily, give a sense of sequencing so it wasn't all kind of monotone or tritone. And that helped, but it's doing this memory palace where I'm actually reciting the passages in slightly different places outside. And so I'm developing a physical sense of memory, and I don't know if this is unnecessary or redundant, but then I've recited it inside the house later, remembering exactly where I was outside, and that's been helpful for association. Because I noticed too when I was practicing certain lines the past couple months, I said, "Huh, I remember exactly where I was standing and what I was looking at when I memorized this line,"
Mm.
because I was probably marching. Because another thing I like to do is I like to march with it because it does has a rhythm that's regular bum 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 ba da dum
How
ba
do you
da
say
dum
it?
bum.
Salvitur ambulando.
Yeah, exactly. Ew, okay. And so yeah, so well, so marching, starting on the left foot, mani nae de te apeleia deo Achilleus, and physically having the somewhat kinesthetic component too is I found helpful. But then I ended up re remembering where I was, like what I was looking at. I was looking at a certain tree or whatever, or I was in the car. It was like, huh, that's interesting. That kind of associative memory. So that stuff seeps in anyway, and you've certainly given me the confidence to not worry about those recursions
Mm.
because that's all part of the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bruno said the only thing that you really have to worry about is that you don't confuse the pitcher from the pitcher. Uh, like
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to say what that ineffable sort of phrase means, but he was very concerned that people become so fascinated with the technique that they never really quite use it. You know, if you
Mm.
think about all the possible things that are involved, like you're just going to get lost. But just doing it will teach you the thing. And he also said that anybody who thinks long and hard enough about it will come to the same conclusion about it that he has. And I think that
Mm.
that's one of the best teachings actually is not enough. Like it's a contradiction. So many
Mm.
people don't think about it enough, and as a result, they don't get anywhere with what they're doing. And some people think about it too much, and as a result, they don't get anywhere because they're not actually doing it. So it's kind of like, when do you think about what you're doing? And I think journaling a little bit about it, uh, getting some insights about your practice, what went wrong, why can't you get this Moharnavam, like what the heck's going on there? Ragged Veshti, Rakshashan Yoga, Shanta Santa Yukta, Atma, Ramo Virajite. Yeah, I'm getting a little closer to my line that I missed, the 50th verse of the thing. I'm also really ill right now. I'm so cold. I keep putting these gloves on and off. So forgive me if I'm a little off here. But I love to have it in memory. It's so beautiful and precious. But the way that I did it is I put aside all of the possible things that could go wrong, and I just focused on what went right, And then
Mm.
so I would advise that to anybody who gets into it. But if you can get the memory palace component right, that's going to make it a lot easier from the beginning. And nobody can really quite, it's the matrix, nobody can tell you what the matrix is. You kind of got to just do it. And
Mm.
then it will mean what it means to you. But I think Bruno's right. It will be the same at the end of the day as everybody else does it in every way that matters. And anything that's
Mm.
personal and so, well, Bruno, I mean, they burned him at the stake. And one of the reasons they burned him at the stake is because he refused to admit that Jesus was a person. And they said to him, what do you mean Jesus was a person? He's like, dude, I don't even believe in persons. Like, I don't even believe in the individual self. Like, why are you badgering me about this guy? Like, I don't even exist. Anyway, uh, I hope that that helps. And I didn't mean to like hijack our discussion about you
Oh, not at
into
all.
this, but
I wanted to ask about these.
I love this topic so much, and I think that that's one thing that we can learn from Bruno. And I wish I knew it, but I actually want to ask you a little bit about how I could get to where I would love to read Bruno, but he's so elusive, you know, like there's so many references to things, and it's quite hard to know where to begin with that project, especially since I don't really want to speak Latin. And I don't know what you would advise because I think that's one of the problems that's so classic here, right? Is
Hmm.
there is a memory component to the mouth. There is a memory component to all of the levels of processing. So you've got the memorizing, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. But then, like nobody is speaking about Bruno,
Hmm.
really, specifically him. And I know you addressed this a bit recently with the thing about lingua latina per se illustrata, and it's just like yes, that's where you want to go in order to unlock the more deep things. But I have this weird feeling that that's not going to unlock Bruno just simply because I have some time with ancient texts, and it's like, no, that guy's Shakespeare. He's inventing stuff the same way Shakespeare invented
Hmm.
stuff. He's making words up, or he's bending them so much. It's like, uh, I don't know. Like, yes, starting here will help, but is it really going to help, or do I have to like hire somebody to translate it for me?
I have answers.
Mm.
And we're gonna talk about all that right now.
But good,
Um,
good.
first, I like to, is are Giordano Bruno's text easily available in Latin online that you're aware of?
I wouldn't use the word easy, but I have links.
If you because if you have one, I could look at it right now and tell you if this is how long it would take you to be able to read this.
Is this now showing
I
uh,
can see the text. Yeah.
Opera Latina Conscripta?
Uh-huh. Very good. And go to any page you like. Could be a specific one or a random one.
There we go. Abit ergo chaos, non statuam, non figuram, non imaginationem seu. I'm not even sure how to go after that. Imagine abilitatum. So those are the things that would really challenge me to memorize, and they clearly have because I stopped.
Right. Okay.
But
So yes,
I'll
the
shut up now.
primo. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, yeah. De primo infigurabile chaos. Cool. Habet ergo chaos non statuam, non figuram, non imaginationem, seu imaginabilitatem, sed rationem, ut pote ratiocinabilitate, non sine veritate. Ipsius triginta sunt articuli.
I mean,
Primus
I
quod
can
index.
track this part, but it's because I spent time on it. Um,
Sure. Primus quod index illius est corporum eodem successio loco. Aeris in impars aeris parti succedit, similiter quae parsa quae parti, unde veque? Is that Veque?
yeah.
On it's neque. It's neque.
Oh
Unde
well,
neque aer,
it's
little
yeah. You're right.
smoke.
It is. Yeah.
Neque
It's
aer, neque aqua interligitur esse spatium, sed in spatio, quod sane illud esse porta buturoque. This is very simple Latin.
is it?
You could easily understand this after finishing Familia Romana and maybe a little bit of some of the other supplemental materials that go in that series. This is
Let's go deeper then.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. I mean, the concepts are in translation. One has to, imagine what he's talking about the water and space, and the in the unsculptable chaos, in
Mm,
figure the unshaped the shapelessness of chaos.
mm.
Which is what he started talking about there. What paragraph would you like me to look at here?
I just skipped in the middle. It
All
can
right,
be the person
51.
who said that he's like Shakespeare and inventing stuff. Is referring to his theater, his plays.
Hmm.
But
All right, on to the left side, 49.
yeah,
Quodatin.
I don't even know what
Yeah.
book we're in anymore. I just skipped ahead.
Oh, good. Well, let's see. Well, that then I mean, I'll let you know if this is crazy out there. Quodatinet ad energumenos seu daimoniacos, qui supra proprium ingenium variis locuntur linguis et habitum variarum scentiarum demonstrat. This is awesome. What as pertains to this is a Greek term, energumenos, those who do,
Mm,
and daimoniacos, spirits, demons perhaps, who beyond their innate ability, speak um, various languages, etapi tum variarum scientiarum, and they demonstrate an awareness of various forms of knowledge. Errant medici crassa quadam pertinacia. Errant, the doctors uh, err or wander with a fat um, tenacity or an intense tenacity. Negantes esse daimones et peregrinos intellectos. This is awesome stuff. I want to read this now. This is also highly intelligible with a kind of a foundational Latin study. Familia Romana is what I tend to recommend for most people. I think
Mm,
certainly you would benefit. Here is how I succeeded with using that book, which I wanted to add too. Um, and I don't think anyone else has done this to my knowledge. I transcribed it because when I had taken a Latin class university prior, and I found it like I did got A's. I was able to memorize paradigms and do some translation. I found it boring as heck, and I never wanted to touch Latin again. Then I went to Italy. I studied Italian there, and I was like, I want to learn Latin now that I've been in Italy, and it was something I wanted to do. Came upon the Dowling method, which got me to the Famiglia Romana, and then when I saw it, like, wow, this is so much more intelligible, so much more interesting than all the other stuff I had seen, and I could just feel that this is what I needed. And the stories were so interesting, and the turns of phrase, the use of prepositions and idioms, and the case system was had a naturalness to it. What the heck did I know? But I just intuited that somehow that I wanted to internalize it, and I just decided I'm going to start transcribing it. I started around chapter 3,
mm,
and didn't do it by hand because I was able to type faster, and I found it equally good for this kind of short-term memory exercise, which was to read the sentence aloud, say, Roma in Italia est, which is the first line, Rome's in Italy, Roma in Italia est, say aloud, hear myself say it, and then transcribe Roma in Italia est, re-saying it. So I was getting these multiple forms of input, the four language learning disciplines of reading, writing, listening, and speaking all at once. And I wasn't memorizing per se the text, but I learned it really, really well. And the things because when you learn a language, you need to learn patterns of morphology and of expressions, idioms, things that you see, such that when you see the word ad, it doesn't throw you. It means towards.
mm.
And so when you see it enough examples, especially in the wonderful context that that book provides, you know exactly what ad means anytime you see it. You'll never be confused. And that's the kind of thing when you see more complicated phrases, more complicated usages that aren't as clear, but you've had lots of examples, and through my transcribing it, I became very intimately familiar with the text, and that ended up being extremely helpful. It's kind of taking advantage of short-term memory. It wasn't an attempt to permanently memorize things like with the paradigms or like I'm trying to do now with the Iliad, but it was a very helpful memory-like memorization-like skill perhaps. And I
Yeah.
found what that did is it really downloaded the Latin language into my brain matrix like to really use that analogy that you brought up earlier. I really felt that way because suddenly I was able to read almost any kind of Latin like the Bruno we just saw. Um and unless it had really peculiar vocabulary, something I just hadn't seen before, even if it did, I'd be like, okay, I know every word but this one. Kind of like when we're in high school and we see a word in a book and we're like, oh, what does this mean? And you look it up in the dictionary or somewhere, and then you find out what it means. You learn vocabulary that way by reading, right? And
Mm.
that's the experience you get after finishing certainly the first book in that series and the others too are very helpful to that effect. So yeah, I'd say you say you don't want to speak Latin. Don't worry. The speaking of Latin is only a tool, much as the memory palace or other mnemonic devices that you teach so well. That don't worry about, you know, some bizarre association of the sailor lady poster with, you know, the some obscure film that you know that I don't. I can't remember. So when something you said that was very, very, very charming that I can't remember at all because it was a personal association. Don't worry
Right, right.
about those things because those end up um being almost like a wormhole, which is able to bridge that gap. You create the linear space first, and then whoop, the neurons are able to just go right to the information you want and need
Mm.
in that way. And similarly, if you incorporate a spoken component, since language itself, lingua, you know, the tongue, the speech, a verbal component is really helpful to be able to read. You don't need to be a fluent speaker, you don't need to compose, but being able to incorporate a little bit of speech, that is to think about the language in a personal way, whether it comes out of your mouth or it's all just heard in your own head, is very useful. So yeah, you don't have to learn to speak Latin fluently, but you can
Mm.
learn to read Latin fluently with a little bit of verbal component. Absolutely.
Right, right. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I should rephrase that. I wouldn't mind learning to speak anything. The question is always just this like how does one arrange one's goals and the Sanskrit project is this and then it's like, well, am I really going to become a Bruno scholar and that? But what's so surprising to me is that I never heard of lingua latina until the internet, right? Like when I was at university and we had the classics component and so forth, it was just the wheel lock basically, right? And then you're tested
Oh,
on
that's
that. You're
right.
not really tested on Latin. You're really just like almost well, I want to ask you about Boris Johnson without being political, but this is another thing
Sure.
without being political. Is it was almost like a period in university where it was a little bit lowballed just to you know uh, get people through. I guess I don't know, but in any case, if that text was there, then I mean, lingua latina. I mean, it would have been way better than. I think you were talking about this in one of your videos. Like, there was a period um, where this is just kind of common where you're just it's grammar or nothing, and that's basically what I had. And it's like, yeah, okay, so I can I can basically remember a conjugation pattern, and it's compounded because of studying German, but it didn't stick because there was no story, there was no uh, nothing like lingua latina at all offered. I just never knew about it.
Can you believe that book's been around since the 60s? It's
Well, I was going
been
to ask you.
updated.
I'm sure
Yeah,
it's old.
Hans Orberg updated it through to the end of his life in 2010, a little bit here and there, but mostly its original form in the 1960s would teach the language essentially just as well as the original
Mm,
that he wrote, which is a charming story. It's not, a Pulitzer Prize novel, but it's a charming story and it's entertaining. You get invested in the characters, and you end up by accident learning Latin. And that's the key of good writing and this kind of comprehensible input story-based method where if you're interested in the story, it'll pull you through and you'll end up learning the languages just because you want to know what happens. That's
mm.
great. Or if you actually, it also can help if it's well done, has pictures and things. You would be like say, ooh, laurel. It's like that's cool. I see a picture of a plant. And I know what that is. It's a picture book. Something about that I think is inherently exciting to someone if that person is the least bit interested in learning a language. So anyway, there's a lot of value to it. But yeah, crazy how even today, predominantly, absolutely, the methods that are used for teaching ancient languages and to a degree even modern languages still is this grammar translation basis because that was a Prussian invention, if I remember. I don't know much about this history. I've mostly just heard others talk about it. The Prussians wanted just the scientific and engineering revolution of the 19th century. The idea was that, oh, well, we just simplify. What do you really need to know? We just need to know the grammar and some little bit of vocabulary, and then that became the standard for learning all foreign languages and something instead of something that was much more personal, much more communicative, which was like the tradition of learning languages is what I talk about being the best way now, which is through stories, which is through interacting in class, through classes being taught in Latin. When you went, I mean, you got to see oh, I love these. And I would be so happy if you ended up learning Latin to the point where I could show you some of these dialogues written for 8-year-olds where the Latin is harder than anything in classical antiquity, but supremely eloquent and just so rich with idiom that it's amazing. Written for 8-year-olds, and it's so much harder than any, even spoken Latin professing teacher today usually encounters. Like how amazing because they started teaching their kids Latin before they even physically went to school. And some of these, these were not, it wasn't every one of these German kids in the city of Cologne where the one teacher was, but the ones who did get to go, they had tutors when they were, 5 and 6. So of course they learned basic German, but they were already being taught in Latin, basic instructions from their home tutor, and then they went off to the school, and then you're in the deep end.
Mm.
At 8. You're not very tall, so hopefully you can swim. And it's incredible. I mean, every time I read like the dialogue one, which is about this first day at school of the kid and the father, and the beauty and clarity of these expressions is so rich. And it's like, wow, I learn something every time I read this stuff. And it blows my mind how that is what the traditional method of teaching Latin is in these ancient languages and any language, which is just you're speaking them because of
Mm.
course you are. Because why would you do this silly Prussian method of learning the mechanical nuts and bolts exclusively? Because in those dialogues too, which are again to help model for the kids how to speak and how to talk. But they talk about grammar and they have like, oh, the teacher said it's the first day. Well, I need to test you. What is
Mhm.
this? How many like what's the genitive of this and what's it? But it's all in Latin, right? So
Mm.
because they're discussing, like was mentioned before, the grammar in the target language, it sticks better and it's a valuable exercise. So yeah, we can talk about Boris Johnson if you want.
Yeah, well, let's get there. But I want to ask, don't want to lose the pronunciation thing, and I want to ask it
Sure.
in a particular way first, and then
Go ahead.
noodle into some things. So, how do you hold yourself to a standard, you personally, when, and I'm sort of bringing my own psychology and experience to it, right? Because I memorize lots of stuff and I just like say it, and I know I've actually I think I just publish this without editing, even though it's going to have radio silence as we put that up on the screen there, because I love to play it straight, right? Like I just memorize stuff. I can memorize stuff, but pronunciation is kind of this thing where I know a lot of times that I'm just probably butchering Sanskrit like crazy. There's like some dudes in India who are like, "Oh man, your Sanskrit pronunciation is amazing," and I'm like, "Well, how do I know that you know, right?" So how do you dealing with ancient Greek, dealing with Latin, and then I think, it's maybe not widely known, but some of us know that there's different times that these things were pronounced at different periods. So, like, two questions. What is the standard you hold yourself to for pronunciation? How do you know? And then how do you know that the people that you have hold you to a standard know?
Well, I'm so glad you have the following 10 hours free for me to begin to explain that to you. I'm just kidding. But that is if I have anything that I could call a career in this, I suppose I've made it by diving into what all a variety of experts have said, including the ancient grammarians themselves, to learn about this because I just find it endlessly fascinating. Yeah, what standard? And I think that's different for everyone depending on their needs and what they're
Mm,
looking for, what they're trying to do.
mm,
Um, let's compare it to a modern language. For example, I'll just do one that we say German or Italian, a couple languages that we have some familiarity with, right? So if there's a native language level proficiency, which is very difficult to attain, but it's possible. But then you have some German speakers who end up becoming the governor of California. They were in Hollywood and yeah, wanted to be viewed but you know, Arnie, love him or hate him, he communicates in perfectly clear and and sometimes even eloquent English with a really strong Austrian German accent. In fact, that's part of his charm. So, if we're to learn, do we want to hold ourselves to try to speak German or Italian with native accent proficiency? That would be great. You have to kind of ask, like, wait, well, why? Well, maybe if you don't want to be seen or heard as a foreigner distinctly immediately when you speak. I sounded like a foreigner in every language I speak. I definitely do in Italian. Um, but ultimately, when you communicate, are you understood? Yes. Something that can be useful for me, I've noticed more and more as I study, say, the pronunciation of the local dialect in Rome. Again, I don't have anything close to proficiency. I've lived there a couple of years, so I've gotten to hear a lot. Studying it and even consciously noting pronunciation things that are peculiar to that city and that region has helped me to understand. And then imitating it a little bit. I'm not any good at it. And of course, I always sound like a foreigner doing, Roman dialect. But that helps to train my ear to notice the pronunciation things better. Now, that's just modern languages. Who cares with an ancient language? When it comes, and that's I think actually the rhetorical implication of that statement, who cares about an ancient pronunciation, is actually a fair conclusion. If pronunciation is of absolutely zero value to you and what you want to read or experience, well, you'll probably be fine. For example, if you were to learn to recite Giordano Bruno in, some version of whatever your teacher was using back in college with Latin, probably, like well, almost every single Latin teacher in the US and Canada and UK speaks, which is a strong English language accent. Well, fine. You'll be able to read Giordano Bruno and appreciate it. Also considering that he was Italian, so probably his pronunciation was very different from the version of kind of restored classical pronunciation that some, North American teacher might be using.
Mm,
So that's going to be hard. So who cares? If you read, as I was able to a moment ago, read Giordano Bruto's text, not in ecclesiastical pronunciation, but in whatever you got, and you understand it, it doesn't matter. Because he's probably not putting too much into that writing that's dependent on sound.
mm,
When it comes to poetry, and this is relevant to the Iliad and also the Bourne Johnson comments that we'll get to later. Um, it doesn't if even if you're still using some kind of strong, let's say in my case, some kind of strong American accent when dealing with the Aeneid, arma vivumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris, Italiam fato profugus. And I tried to use as much as I could typical American accent when reciting those first lines. But as I did just recite the beginning of the Aeneid, there I was maintaining the meter. Now, Virgil, he had his own pronunciation. Evidently, had a little bit of a northern Italian, ancient Italian accent in his Latin. He was from Mantua, as we recall from Dante mentioning it. Um, and the ancient peoples had different accents too. So, how would that have been? That's a difficult thing. But when it comes to the really important thing about that piece of poetry is that if I recite it without the meter, and that is without the distinct long and short syllables of the Latin, whether it sounds more Italian-like or with the kind of precision that I try to put in my Latin pronunciation, which would be something like this. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus, la vignaque venit litora. That's how I recite it, which is, I think, a very reasonable reconstruction of classical Latin pronunciation. But even if I did it again like the American way, arma rivumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris, the rhythm is still there. Virgil wanted you to hear and feel the rhythm. And so that was the main thing. There are other elements of the phonology where if we use a v instead of a w or a ch instead of a k, that is differences between ecclesiastical pronunciation and classical pronunciation. Some of the jokes in, say, Plautus or Terence, they will make sense because they were using alliteration.
mm.
And you're like, if you have a ki and a ka and a ku, then it's funny. But if it's chi and ka and ku, it's not that weird, but it doesn't have the same impact. Romans thought alliteration was hilarious for some reason. And once you start reciting like Plautus aloud, which is the comedian, you realize, oh, this is hilarious.
Oh, the brothers Maniachemi, is it? Brothers Maniachemi, that's
Oh yeah,
hilarious.
oh that's so funny. That's so funny. Are the Amphitrio were
Oh yes,
Socius.
Amphitrio. Oh, with Saturn and the whole the birth of Hercules kind of story, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Or Heracles, I guess.
This like this sounds like a little like a chicken or something, and you can imagine the actor doing it, and you put your own inevitably modern interpretation on it, but you get to feel what they're trying to do to make you laugh, and it is funny once you get familiar with it, which is interesting. It's sort of like we were talking about the ineffable
Mm.
thing that comes out of this intimate connection to it. So there is a lot of value because what is our goal as speakers of Latin? Well, unless we're just doing it for a hobby or because we want to write original compositions, I've dabbled a little bit in that. Mostly, though, it's for all of us just to be able to read the ancient stuff better. And if we have a really, very general sense of like all of the Latin, which is more than it's 2,000 years essentially of literature, from antiquity to the 19th century and the 20th century, because they're great authors of the 20th and 21st century who are now writing poetry and plays. colleagues and friends of mine. And so there is a lot to begin. But what pronunciation do you need? Well, what pronunciation was the author using? Like if you're seeing something like the Carmina Burana, classical pronunciation is not going to work so well. So
That's
anyway,
a
so there are these
beautiful,
different.
beautiful piece.
Oh yeah, actually, I don't like how Karl Orff did it at all,
You
um,
don't know?
because I mean, music is great.
Mm.
Those are drinking songs.
Oh, were they?
Those are, yeah, and he put this incredible, powerful weight behind them, which I just think is it sounds kind of odd to me. I love the music. I grew up listening to it. Then I realized, wait a minute, I don't think he means what these things is. That's my interpretation. But anyway,
Right, right, right.
I don't mean to be such an art critic, but um I did
Well,
one of them.
you did dismiss Troy, so we might as well own it.
Oh yeah. I also like watching film reviews. That's probably my most frivolous pastime is to watch film reviews of bad Hollywood movies that I'll never watch because I just
Right,
find
right,
that
right.
entertaining. But I do like the analysis of theater and dramatic action and
Mhm.
character and story and those kinds of things. But when it
Well,
comes to
I love it.
go
Let's
ahead.
criticize Carl Orff. I know,
No.
but yeah, I didn't actually know that. I know what you're talking about. Dun 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 dun. But I didn't know that it actually had an origin in beer songs or drinking songs. But it's
I
fascinating.
did one of them in which I named it by the last line that I my version of it. It basically the rhythm of it is works for traditional kind of Renaissance or even old, really older, the medieval era melodies like say Yankee Doodle. And I did
Mm.
one on Yankee Doodle on my Scorpiomartianus channel. I did the melody of Yankee Doodle and it's I can't remember the I need to memorize more lyrics so I could sing stuff off the top of my head, but
Well, the
and
reason
it's
why it
like
seized upon it is because
yeah.
it seems like it is an issue in pronunciation. It's just a pronunciation by different means. So
Mm,
adaptation is a big thing in the ancient world. When we think of Aeschylus doing Oedipus, right? It's just like a lot of people aren't really aware that that's one version of like oodles of versions of Oedipus, and his quote unquote, and maybe I'm bending things here, but his quote unquote pronunciation of the Oedipus myth is now pronunciation writ large in terms of plot construction, choice of words
mm,
within the delivery of the plot. So I
yeah.
totally appreciate the idea of like, okay, so Carmina Urbana or the Karl Orff piece, that might not be a
Well,
pronunciation that suits one's taste of
yeah, yeah.
a larger piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's such a whimsy in the poetry that the gravitas that he gives it. Well, I mean, it creates a unique piece of art, and but there's some other interpretations of those poems musically that I don't know. They work better for me, so shall we say?
Yeah.
But
No, I want to
the
rethink it all. I love that one where the guy is burning on fire, but if there's a version where that's like humorous instead of torturous the way it is in the Karl Orff, I want to hear it. I want to know it.
yeah,
Or if it's
yeah,
otherwise executed. I just didn't know. But I jump on it because it is to me that in my mind that is a kind of pronunciation issue, just looked at a little
mm,
bit differently.
yeah. You asked the about like what certainty have I in the reconstruction of a certain pronunciation? Um, Latin and ancient Greek, boy, they're both so ancient. Where do I start? Well, basically, we have received wisdom that comes from manuals that are available today, such as Sidney Allen's Vox Graeca and Vox Latina, which what do? They say, well, this is the reconstructed pronunciation of, say, classical Greek or classical Latin. How do we know? And then they'll point you to say, well, we have this ancient grammarian or this ancient author says this about this. Like, for example, I remember before I was able to steadily convince my whole audience, Italians in particular, that this classical pronunciation is a legitimate reconstruction. Italians aren't super comfortable with that because it just sounds foreign to them.
Mm.
That it's cena in classical Latin instead of cena for dinner. It's cena in modern Italian, so it's the same word, just slightly different pronunciation. How do we know that? And we know that because an ancient grammarian, say Quintilian, for example, specifically states that the letters Q and K and C are completely redundant because they have the exact same sound and our place of articulation in the mouth.
Mm.
We don't use K hardly at all, says Quintilian, except for a couple words like calendai, the calendar. Um, and we use Q with a U, which there's some interesting historical reasons for that come from Etruscan. And we use C for everything else, but they all have the same sound in the same place of articulation in the mouth.
Right.
And well, that means well, ka and ch have very different articulations, or certainly different enough so where such a statement is not tenable with a pronunciation that where chena has to be the ancient pronunciation. And there are no serious philologists for sure who would suppose such a thing. It's more just people who was very interesting because it becomes political, which you want to avoid politics. But is it possible? Because language and pronunciation has a political element too,
Yeah,
by
yeah.
which I mean more a matter of subjective preferences that are connected with personal experience.
Mm.
Italians, for example, until some I don't know American like me just comes around who speak Latin in Rome for no reason, becomes acquainted with the notion that there is another pronunciation. Their first accusation is you're saying China wrong. It's not China, it's China. But because you're an English speaker, that's your English accent.
Mm.
Absurdities like that. I've seen that hundreds of times on so many videos that I know that that's the first thing that comes to them. These things that you can't pronounce it right. That is in the ecclesiastical or traditional Italian pronunciation way because of your native English speaker. Well, I definitely have a native English oral posture and aspects of my phonology and schwas and some other things that slip into certainly my Italian and definitely my Latin too, more often than I would want. But those are limitations of my own speech that have nothing to do with the reconstructed phonemic system.
Mm.
Um, the so it's so in time though, I have been able to convince these people through various videos that no, this is we have the evidence from all these different sources, how Italian, I'll say AE is pronounced not I. You're saying it's not Caesar, it's Cesar. You're saying it wrong, but it's like, no,
Mm.
there's a reason I'm doing it. Anyway, it's really funny. But then you point out that the word, well, Kaiser in German and, and Tsar,
Mm.
and all these different words, they ultimately come from Latin. Even in Greek, in modern Greek, it's Gesar and it's was Caesar in ancient Greek. So I mean, like you just there's enough logic around the whole thing that once you piece it all together, you do get a phonemic system that's pretty clear. Then you can get to really tiny stuff. When did ke become che?
Mm.
When did final M finally disappear? What was the realization of final M? Was it a nasalization of the preceding vowel? Lots of different things. My consilium, my boule, my advice,
Mm.
to use the ancient languages for no particular reason, I guess. Just
Well,
because I
it's
like the
love, isn't it? It's love.
yes, it's is that the pronunciation system that you employ and try to develop with an ancient language should help you achieve your goal. If your goal is to read literature, um, which is for everyone, then especially if it's, say, classical literature, well, it's probably good to at least know the classical pronunciation, maybe even employ it regularly when you recite, because you'll end up, especially when it comes to phonemic vowel, more than anything else, the phonemic vowel length, the syllable length, the fact that they're like Japanese, they're this distinct long and short syllables that will show you how even prose authors are trying to move you with their words.
Mm.
Cicero in his rhetoric, even in his personal letters, is using those things in ways that can be identifiable in a scientific way. It looks kind of like metrical or poetry, or the rhythmical in certain ways. And insofar as we want to appreciate that literature, to try to attain, because the literature is not for foreigners, almost none of it. It was all for native speakers or really competent L2 speakers, second language speakers of Latin and Greek. So if we get to the pronunciation that the author was expecting his listeners to have, then we will be able to appreciate the literature at yet a deeper level and then discover all kinds of things that might not be discoverable. And like you were mentioning, that ends up necessitating with different authors, potentially different pronunciations. And for example, if you get out of the classical period into, like the Archipoeta, the author of some of that, that stuff that Karl Orff was drawing from, then you get a pronunciation that's not going to work for classical pronunciation. Not really. You'd be forcing stuff into it that might help your comprehension if that's the pronunciation you prefer, but wasn't what the poet had in mind. And so those end up becoming issues at a kind of at an aesthetic level. Um, but if you're just getting raw information, then the pronunciation doesn't really matter that much.
Oh, that's good to know. But one thing that you may be interested, if you don't already know about this, in memory systems, the numbers are associated with consonants,
Mm,
and it has a history. It goes back to the Katapayadi in India, but in the Romance languages or in Europe, you have one associated with, or zero associated with a soft C, S, and Z, one associated with a D or T, two with an N, three with an M, four with an R, five with a L, six with a ch, sh, j sound, and then seven with a K or hard G, eight with an F or V, and nine with a B or P. And the
mm,
thing to notice with that is T and D for one, t, d, in the same place of the mouth. Uh,
mm,
so not all of them have multiple variations, although some people say three as M could also be W because you would just flip it upside down, but that doesn't WM. Yeah, I guess it does have a somewhat similar mouth placement. But
yeah,
for
they're
six,
labial.
six, ch, sh, j, and seven, k, hard G, g, nine, p, b, eight, f or v, f, v. So there's something going on here in our deep history where the people who came up with these mnemonic systems for numbers, they either naturally sort of evolved that association to
Mm,
pair them that way, which I kind of doubt, or they grouped them that way. Maybe after they observed a natural thing, they more codified it. I don't know, but that's sort of like articles and declensions kind of stuff. Like, where does it all come from? Is there some clear
mm,
origin to it? But if you don't already know the major system, you might find that fascinating when you learn
mm,
it, because one way to help yourself remember the associations is just to think where they are in the mouth.
mm. That's interesting. Which reminds me too of something I wanted to mention in trying to remember some line of the Iliad that I'm working on.
Mm,
Say it's been a few days since I've looked at it, or tried to remember it. Then I find, excuse me, then I can't quite remember it, but yet my mouth goes into the position of the vowel, and my
mm,
tongue to the articulation of the consonant, and then I'm like, oh, it's etimesagamennon. I remember now, and
right?
because my mouth was kind of pulling me there. It's fascinating that the kinesthetic aspect too of this
Mm,
recitation aloud.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
one thing to memorize something, but to be able to do it aloud, you're basically just incorporating more tools in your arsenal, I think, for the purposes of memorization.
Well, the number systems are well worth it because maybe they don't help directly with pronunciation, but if you learn that system that I just rattled out,
Mm,
you have man. Let's just stick with a simple thing that that's come up again and again, or mun, or how mean, or mn word, right? Men,
hmm
whatever it is. If it's an mn word, if three is an m and two is an n, and I do this all the time. Well, that's 32. So I think man, and then who's the most famous man that I can think of? Well, it's Johnny Cash, the Man in Black. So if I'm lacking any image, I just look at the consonants, figure out what the number is, and then because I have images from 00 to 99, there's always an image and it's always deeply personalized. So, in Sanskrit, there's a certain word for sin that sounds a lot like Pope. So 99 is Pope because nine can be B or P, right? I
mm.
usually use the singer from Ghost rather than the real post Pope because I try to avoid sacrilege. but nonetheless, like these kinds of things. Then 98 is Maury Povich, and 97 is then Pac-Man, and then 96 is then George Bush, because now I'd use the B instead of the G. Oh, I can't avoid politics. But you're right, language is political. But 95, PAL, and so on. Like everything has a pattern. And so basically all of the possible, maybe not all of them, but The diacritical marks always throw things for a twist. But many of the possible consonation combinations are representable by numbers, and the numbers can be paired to create images like Pac-Man or what have you. And you can have them all from 00 to 99. And then anything you look at, you'll instantly have an image if you
Hmm.
want to think about it numerically.
Oh,
And then you just
amazing.
have your memory palace, and it's like Lego, mental Lego.
Yeah. Going through the Rolodex
Mm.
and finding it. I will look into it. That sounds fascinating. I had a question too about the method of the loci. Who came
Yeah,
up with that?
who came up with it? Oh, I think humanity did. I don't know that
I mean the
it.
term especially. When did that
Oh,
term come into usage?
well, so here's a name that I like to pronounce in different ways, and I know it irritates some people, but I like to say Simonides rather than
Huh.
Simonides. Um, and I heard that from somebody one time who I don't know if it's right or wrong, but anyway,
Hmm.
Simonides of Kos uh,
Yeah, really.
is attributed with the idea of and you may know the story of him and Castor and Pollux outside waiting for him. I don't know. Do you know that story?
No, tell me.
Okay, I'll try to do it short because I usually like to elaborate it. But the idea is that Simonides of Kos, he's like a great poet, and he's been invited to a banquet by a guy named Scolpus, I think his name was. Or maybe it's a Scorus because the P can be R. I don't know. But anyway, Scopus, let's call him. And so there's these people at the banquet, and Simonides is doing his thing. He's just like ripping out poetry left, right, and center. And he says, and I want to now do my final poem in honor of Castor and Pollux, because those gods, they're next level, whatever. And then he then goes to Scopus and he says, okay, my speech is done, time to pay. And Scopus is like, well, maybe you should ask Castor and Pollux because you praised them instead of me, and I'm the guy who put this thing together
Uh,
after all. So they're arguing about this, and a messenger comes in and says, Simonides, come, 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 come. Get there's somebody who wants to talk to you. And so he goes outside and there's two figures out in the distance and they're like, come closer, come closer. Anyway, it turns out it's Castor and Pollux. And then they say, okay, you're close enough. And an earthquake destroys the banquet hall, killing everybody inside, which is not funny. And then Simonides
oh.
is asked, like, do you remember where these people are? Because we're trying to identify the dead and we'd like to give them an honorable burial. And he's like, of course I do. I mean, this is where the poet was sitting. This is where the philosopher was sitting. And that's where that villainous Scopus was sitting. And so they were able to uh, honor the dead, which was very important then as now. So the 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 collected locus, I think would be the correct plural, involve individual loci. Um, and so that I think is where probably so this is called
Okay.
Francis Yates calls this the Herenium pattern because
Oh.
it's in Rhetorica ad Herenium. I don't
Right.
think the story is told necessarily with such elaborate um, things there. I don't. It's told in many different ways throughout the literature, but at the end of the day, probably Rhetorica ad Herenium is, which was thought to be Cicero, but recently I think
Yeah,
they said that it was
speciously,
not.
it's
Um,
no, it doesn't really seem like his writing, but
so whoever wrote it, who knows? But what Yates says is that that's probably one of the first places. But I think there's this thing called the dialexesis, or I never learned how to pronounce it, but Aristotle refers to this in De Memoria, this
mm,
earlier text. So I don't know exactly where it comes from, but in the West, even though I don't know that I would necessarily think of ancient Greece as the West, but nonetheless, in the let's just call it the Western tradition, that's probably the origin of using loci and locus for
mm.
individual stations in memory palaces.
It's very interesting. But the reason I asked is because the word locus means two things, and its plural is different depending on its meaning.
Mm.
And locus, it's a second declension now. You remember that from Latin class probably, and it's masculine. So its plural should be loci. However, normally when we say places, the plural becomes neuter, loca.
Mm.
So when I heard the method of loci or loci. So first, like English pronunciation of Latin, there are all kinds of different traditions. Loci or loci, those both follow certain patterns and traditions in the English language ways of pronouncing Latin words. I have nothing wrong with either one. Loci, loci. If you want to make it more Latin, classical Latin sounding, loci is fine. Loci, loci. I think loci, because if we're going to make the letter I to sound like I instead of E, we might as well just anglicize everything. So loci works for me. I think that's the full-on English way to do it. Even loci, perhaps. Or loci, that's what I would do. I would say loci.
Mm,
Um, and that's I remember hearing the term also used in other like de dealing with places or stations in English, like loci, almost like foci, focus, foci. Um, but the word but so what does loci mean in Latin? And it means passages in a book or some other text, which
mm,
is interesting. So um the I guess I was curious like if this actually was a term used in Latin historically, like say in the Renaissance at least or something, then it would be well then it would probably be genitive plural, locorum. And the English language tradition of saying loci instead of loca would just be due to the fact that there are all kinds of terms that we use um, that are that have completely different meanings in English due to all kinds of very valid reasons. Take, for
mm.
example, the Latin word vagina means sheath. It has nothing to do with genitalia, but it does in modern English, and it has that meaning. So it's completely fine for words to change their meaning, and they do, and they must
Yeah.
inevitably in all languages as they're borrowed. So, because my intuition would be called the method of loca if it's places, but that's also my pedantry as a Latinist.
Yeah, I haven't looked at rhetoric ad hominum in Latin, so I don't even know, how it shows up there. I just take it on having read it in English and read commentaries on it and so forth. But something comes to mind that let me throw this into the mix.
Mhm.
In Sanskrit, Atmavacharya, which could be Atmavicharya, but whatever, I'll just go with what I've heard. Atmavacharya is self-remembering, sometimes called self-inquiry. So what is it? Is it remembering or is it inquiry into the self? But there's also loka vicharya, which is inquiry into what we would call current events, politics, like all this sort of stuff,
Oh.
or remembering of the status quo, let's say, or what's going on in the
Mm.
world. So that's got a location specifically stated, linked with some kind of memory or reflection practice.
Mm.
So when you say that, this can have a textual reference, I think that's probably part of the answer to it.
Mm.
Because there was a time when people believed the world was a book that was read. And so this kind of comes back to this Thomas Bradwardine question. Does he mean with uh, memoria rerum, does he mean memorizing things or does he mean memorizing the gist of things? And then is auditorium and is verborum, is that what he means when he's talking about memorizing verbatim? But one way or
Mm.
the other, not everybody, but some of those people thought the world was a book from which we read, and they thought that it was built from letters, literally. So I've always wondered, in principio erat verbum, why the heck isn't it in principio erat uncial or whatever is for letter, right? I don't know, but at the end of the day, that's maybe part of the answer to the debate about loci versus loci versus loca versus whatever.
I think it's all fine, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to Latin and Greek words used in English. Like especially with these Greek names, like as I read a lot of Simonides, I'm just used to seeing his name in Greek letters and using an ancient Greek pronunciation for the poetry. So I have certain ancient authors and characters from history that I don't really think of their name in that ancient pronunciation that I happen to use conventionally. Um, so I don't think it matters. Simonides is very fluid sounding. Though sometimes I'm thrown by how Brits like to pronounce in English certain ancient names. I can't think of any of the top of my head, but they'll do things that I find um, I don't just different. And because you can, of course, in English do different things. So it doesn't really matter because you're anglicizing it.
Mm.
Simonides, Simonides, Shimonides, whatever. It's all, I think they're all useful. I don't know what
I
we're talking
think
about.
I didn't even think of making it a SH sound, but I think Shimonides, like Simonides, it just sounds so
That is,
great. It sounds
I,
amazing.
yeah, I'm doing the retracted S. If you, I don't know, you heard me talking about that, where
Mm,
in modern Greek, and certainly also in ancient Greek, the S was most likely a retracted sound. Well, so in modern Greek, if they say like, what's a good example? Um, Isis is you, or si, you singular. So it's because they don't have a sh phonemically, they don't have that as an individual sound. These S sounds are sh, so sa, za, sha, zh. Those are all called sibilants,
mm,
which means sibilare means to whisper. So that's their name. And that's what they're called in linguistics, sibilants. Well, Greek only has one, both in antiquity and today. It's essentially just one, which is that means it's not competing. And when we do "sa" in English versus they have a different frequency, which is what distinguishes them. And there's frequencies of consonants we're actually perceiving and turning into information in our head, which is amazing. But the s versus the sh, they have because there are two of them and they compete for space. It's about the tongue's placement when we say them. In English, Italian, and other languages that have a sh, the s is more fronted, and the sh is inherently a more retracted sound. And Sanskrit, of course, has three of these, which just makes it amazing. And some Slavic languages have three or four, I don't know, eight. I don't remember. I have to check Polish again. Polish is insane and very beautiful. And
Zajebiście.
yeah, Jindal, but it's like and so it has all these sounds. So because of that, ancient Greek tends to and modern Greek and European Spanish, a number of Finnish, a number of languages that don't have a sh separate. They don't force their s to be super fronted the way we do in English most of the time or Italian because what's the point? They got all the space. So ends up creating this really cool sound like or if you hear like say a Spaniard speak Spanish, this is different from Latin American Spanish where they'll say they'll say zapatos, shoes, zapatos. But of course, we'll do th for the z in the zeta in Spain. So say zapatos, but instead of zapatos, it'd be zapatos. So it's not quite zapatos. It's not that
Mm,
low a frequency. It's not that retracted the tongue, but it's in between. Anyways, that's what I was doing. That's why it sounds like Shimonides. That's why it sounds kind of like a sh. It sounds in between because it is.
mm.
Yeah.
That's cool. I think about it a lot because I get so many comments about my pronunciation, and I never know quite how to react because it seems to me just such a non-issue if you understand me, like if you know what I'm talking about. But the one that
Mm.
really I have allowed to get my goat, and I want to get your opinion on it, just since we're in this general realm here. And it just surprises me. It's the most surprising thing in the world, and I think it tells a lot about I don't know what it tells about, but I made a video called Aristotle's Nuclear Alphabet, and I have had so many people comment to me that I do not pronounce the word nuclear correctly. And I looked into it, and there is actually a video about how the pronunciation of nuclear has changed over time. And I was just like, well, what the heck? I don't even hear myself saying it in a way that is different than like I've never heard anybody say nuclear. I've never heard that. And so does that mean that it isn't said that way, or is it just that I don't hear it? Now,
Well,
I mean, I just I wonder immediately, like, how do you have time to type this? There's some special way to pronounce nuclear, but also I
it,
get
it's
really
a
super
it's a
curious.
shibboleth.
I get so
It's a shibboleth.
curious.
It's a shibboleth. You heard of that before? The shibboleths?
Well, I've heard of the term, but I'm
Yeah,
not
it's
sure.
like if I remember it's yeah, different speakers of Semitic languages either have use a sh or a sa in different positions. Good
Mm,
example is how shalom in Hebrew is salam in
mm,
Arabic. It's the
right,
same word, it just means peace.
right.
And the vowel is changed in between them, but also the sa is a sh. So shibboleth was pronounced by a different. I'm trying to remember this story, but I can't remember if this is actually these are actually speakers of Hebrew or different Semitic languages. sometime in antiquity, but there was the term itself was used like a password. Like they would make people say shibboleth, and if they say it's sibboleth, oh, you're not our people, you're
Mm.
spy, because you're
Right.
pronouncing the word. You can't say sh, or you're not saying sh on that word. So in this way, it seems like a shibboleth that people use with the word nuclear to as a way to point out intelligence. Like you're uneducated if you say it the wrong way.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, it's the way it's spelled is it's from Latin nux, which means nut, it means walnut.
Mm.
So the adjective nucleus is it's the nut. It's the core of the fruit. It's nucleus. And English though is peculiar and because our L does different things. And where did you grow up, by the way?
I grew up in Western Canada,
Uh-huh.
which I'm sure has an impact on everything.
No, not on
And
this word because uh
no,
yeah, I
maybe
mean
not.
we have North American English is highly similar. We have you and I, for example, have although there are differences in our accents, it's mostly identical.
Right.
They're much more similar than say either of our accents is to say British or Australian English, for example. So something that we have in common is that our L tends to be velarized in all positions. So that means the velum is the sort of the back of the mouth. Um, if you think of how the word light is a good example. If you think of how a British person would say light, the la is has this lighter or brighter sound, the way they call it. It's more like say Italian or Spanish when it's in the beginning of a syllable or the beginning of a word, light. Whereas I say light and it's l, it's not as strong as Russian accent or Ukrainian sound as l that you hear in a lot of say Slavic languages. I love that sound. I think it's really cool. Or Portuguese, for example, that can do that. But it is there and it's distinct and it's this like I don't call myself Luke like a Brit would call me
Mm.
but Luke. Of course, the vowel is different, but the L in particular is L. The back of the tongue is kind of going down. So there's articulation that's in sort of the back of the mouth. Now, what does that do? The back of the mouth is also the articulation point of the vowel U of oo, in the simple sense of oo. So if we say ooh, our lips are rounding, but also the tongue is involved in doing ooh. So when we say our North American la, it's almost like an essence, if you will, of ooh is incorporated into it. This is also true of the love, Slavic languages or other languages that have that lovely sound. So the when we get the word nuclear, we have the nuke part. We have an oo vowel, oo, that's really close to it, and then we get an L, which is also very oo like. Why am I saying all this? Because there are two pronunciations that are common: the nuclear and then there's nuclear, nuclear. Say if I say them so slowly, nuclear and nuclear.
Mm.
Um, and that transition, basically, essentially, it's almost a metathesis, meaning a switching of two sounds in a word that's going on. And metathesis is so common. It's in fact a fundamental characteristic of certain languages that you have to do it, and like ancient Greek, that's another discussion. Um, and it happens in this word accidentally, particularly in North American speakers of English, and especially because of this velarization, this ooification of the L that we do anyway. So when I say nuclear, the L is already kind of bunched up into an oo shape, and oo is very close to the U that we do all the time anyway. So nuclear essentially is euphonic. It sounds better and it's easier to say based on our own native phonology as North American English speakers. So nuclear rolls off the tongue more than nuclear. So if you said it wrong and people are trying to hold that against you, it's like, well, a lot of people do that. And a lot of people pronounce things in all kinds of ways in
Mm.
the English speaking world. Um, and say all kinds of bizarre things. Like I can never think that the Brits sound anything but totally uneducated when they say something has been proved. Though I know that of course that's but I'm exaggerating because of course that's silly for me to think that.
Mm.
It's just because my American English has made me feel that proven is the right past participle, and that
Right.
proved in that word. Because I dove, and I might even say Divin because why not?
Sean and Shone is another one. I'm always surprised when I hear on audiobooks saying Shone, and I was,
You say
it's
Sean for Shone?
yeah. I always have said
Really?
Sean my entire life. I've never, and it was only when audiobooks arrived on this. Well, audiobooks had been around for quite some time, but they exploded at a certain point with the internet. It was only
Wow.
then that I started to hear shone, the light shone, and I was just like, "What is this?" But I didn't do it in a way that was like a shibboleth against the person. I just thought that's so fascinating because I'd never heard it that
I
way before.
I'd never heard Sean before for Shone, and I that sounds great. Why not? Because it's just because when you learn about these the way that languages change. I've been studying Old English recently, which is a lot of fun, and you see just how everything is just so variable and how it's changed, creating all these different accents and dialects. You know, we take for granted that, oh yeah, the Brits just say it that way, and Americans will say this way, and Canadians will say do this, Australians will this way, or what, whatever. And then if we're used to that, that's fine. But then if we're but if it's something that's not, as an accepted part of a regional variety, oh, you're silly because yeah, who cares? I don't know. I I don't know. I That's orthoepy, the correct pronunciation. There's a right way to pronounce it. It's very prescriptive. I think it's fun, maybe, to potentially to say, oh, it should be this way. But the other part of it is who cares? When I heard you pronounce the word nuclear a little while ago, I heard you kind of using both pronunciations back and forth, I think, but
Spot like
doesn't matter.
I just I don't know, but I guess I'd love to talk forever, but maybe let's have three last questions and get Boris in
Sure.
there because I don't have a way of judging his pronunciation, but how, like on this topic, what I want to ask is how do you keep modest? Because you know a lot, and I mean I'm not praising you, and you've mentioned that's flattering all the time. I don't mean to flatter you. I mean it's just obvious. You I think often since I read this book by Adam Gopnik called The Real Work, right? And it's just kind of obvious when people have put in the real work. And if you read this, I think you'll see what I mean. It's a term from magic. I'm a magician, and there is the thing of that's what magicians say, like what's the real work on that illusion or whatever, right? Um,
Mm.
and you have exposed the real work over and over and over again, and like as I mentioned, it's like you got so much stuff going on. How do you keep modest? I mean, and keep your head screwed on straight and be able to just say, yeah, you can play games with pronunciation, but who cares? Because a lot of people clearly do, and it's a power that they have. It is a shibboleth, but you don't. And what is the secret?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose it depends. If one is to take I can take a typical English speaker who's reciting Latin with that's with a pronunciation system that is inspired by the classical Latin pronunciation, but pronounces something like how I did Arma rivumque cano Troiae qui primus laboris, like that. Sounds like I'm saying Boris. We're hitting on him. We're not letting that go. We're coming to him. Um, and I'm not doing ra, I'm doing ra. I'm doing all these other sounds that are very much like that are just my native English phonology. I'm just trying in this hypothetical version of myself to map English sounds onto where they ought to belong, relatively speaking, their equivalents in Latin. If so, that's a working conventional pronunciation. You're doing something, and it's clearly of value. But if one is going to take that and then say, the way my Latin teacher pronounces it, is it that way, and he's using the classical pronunciation of the first century BC. Well, then no. Because there are all sorts of characteristics in such a pronunciation which are just cannot be, and certainly were not part of the ancient Latin pronunciation. That would be where it's like, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. That's not what it is. There's nothing wrong with using it, but I've done it because I, of course, did some more popular videos, for example, on the Barbarians TV show, which they had spoken Latin. And I decided to make videos where I was critiquing some of the Latin pronunciation. Most of it was really good, but I was looking for to nitpick on stuff because I think about these little tiny little details. I think it's fun. Insofar as those actors who were speaking the Latin, most of whom were Italian, insofar as they did a good job, I praise them. But I also know, well, they're doing this thing incorrectly in a perfect hypothetical reconstructed pronunciation because, of course, they're native speakers of Italian, most likely. And also, I can hear from their intonation, they don't speak Latin. They're just memorizing their lines and acting as best they can. So the intonation goes in the wrong spot. Things like that. That's, or they'll do a consonant peculiar, or a vowel is too short, or little details. There, I'm feel freer to offer a precise critique, hopefully not too biting, because they're trying to represent the la ancient language very uh verosimiliter, very much similar to the real thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Verisimilitude.
so like yeah,
Yeah.
so very here's suit. It's there.
Mm.
It's and so they it should be so it'd be great if we're just a little bit better at a few areas, but they're also actors working in the horrible cloudy rainy conditions in Hungary, I think. So I cut him some slack as far as like, oh, it's still, if it only were a well-written show. It's certainly, as far as imagining this, one of the best representations that there is of the sound of Latin spoken by ancient Roman soldiers that's been put onto film. It's great. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I think one could do better. But that's one. Who is this one? It wasn't, those actors in that time period, that situation. So that's one part of it. And that's where I'd say like where I've not demonstrated any level of modesty by being very precise in my nitpicks about this or that. And, and when you hear Latin said by someone an actor in a movie who, whatever, they could be using ecclesiastical pronunciation, but they have no idea what they're saying. And I could tell, I find, maybe point and laugh and a little bit at that, but, whatever. They're not Latin speakers, not trying to necessarily represent, um, the language. So that would be the difference. However, when it comes to, being modest. In fact, I'd even prefer the adjective humbled because it's humbling. And I like also how humilis in Latin, humile just means, humble and say in Italian, but humilis in Latin comes from humus, which means the dirt, the humus, and like posthumous. And so,
Mm.
or well, if you're in the dirt, that's what the meaning is in Latin of humilis, that you're low. It's not a compliment in Latin. And I feel humbled by how much I don't know. Because, I can talk all day about, only 1% of Latin has been translated. And, I run into this Giordano Bruno and it's great. Wow, I can read that. But it's also like, I've never read anything he wrote. I know who he was. I know its contributions to, astronomy and all kinds of things and philosophy, but I've never read that. I need to do that. I also need to read Simonides. I've only read a few of fragments of his poetry. I need to read all of the Iliad. Actually, I did re realize something. Here's something humbling. I've been memorizing, at least proving, I have by YouTube shorts and Instagram reels, that I'm at least memorizing one line of the Iliad every day. And I realized, wow, at this pace, doing a back of the envelope calculation, I could memorize the entire Iliad in 42 years. One line a day, and that's how long it would take. And that's humbling. It's like, wow, this
Mm.
is not the hardest thing I've ever done. I'm able to do it in my free time. I'm able to at least do short-term memory to make sure, because I've seen all the lines several times now, but I remember most of them. But make sure I get them all flawlessly with correct pronunciation and do okay and close my eyes and prove I'm doing it on, and hold up the phone in front of my face and do that. And I can do that, but it would take me 40 years to do that. So people who actually, rhapsodes who had both the Iliad and Odyssey and Antiquity memorized, and they went around, of course it was their job. It was their only job because you'd have to constantly practice your whole life, just like a professional musician has to do to stay good. It's like, wow. And by the way, the Iliad and the Odyssey is just the beginning of all of the literature in the West. So I've read, I'm comfortable with, and so I've read more. I'm definitely much better read in literature in Latin than I'm in English and ancient Greek practically at this point too. If especially to say the classics at least. Yeah, I've read a lot of news articles and everything and all the common modern stuff in English, but I mean when it comes to like the really important books, way more I've read in Latin. in Greek too. And I've barely scratched the surface. And it is so much. And there's so much to know. And there's so many, as much comfortable I am, speaking in conversational Latin, it's not particularly eloquent or, either Latin speakers who are just tremendous. They sound like Cicero. They're amazing. And they're inspirational to me. And it
Hmm.
would take so much time. There's so much to know. So, I mean, I have done the work to get to this point, but the humbling feature of all of this and the also the joy of it, there's so much more to learn. And that's a good thing. That's what I try to convince myself of.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I share that. I mean, if memory is my muse, I have the exact same feeling with memory. I feel like I don't even know a thing, you know? It's it's been a long time that I've been studying it, and I am honored and shocked all the time that somebody says, "Oh, did you know so and so said such and such in this book?" I'm like, "What? How did I miss this?" And it's the gift, really, to constantly have more to proceed with. But you kind of got to have to. I mean, it humbles me, but it also needs humility because you just don't know what you don't know, and
Mm.
yeah. So I love that answer, and it's a good one for lots of people to consider, and that's part of why I asked, like, where does this guy have time to type that nuclear is? There's so much other things to do. But in any case, I love that. So, what do you think about Boris Johnson? And I think not knowing any way to assess it because I haven't memorized it myself or worked with ancient Greek to that or Homeric Greek to that level at all. I thought, wow, this is cool. Like, what do you think?
I had the same impression when I first saw that video a few years ago. And it's like, wow, that's cool. He's clearly had, a strong English accent the way he's doing it. Um, and I guess I'd seen the first line back then, but I was avoiding Homeric Greek for as long as I possibly could to try to form a foundation around a more prose like Greek, which is the classical Greek, um, and the Koine, just to start with something a little bit more tangible I could utilize. And so trying to avoid as long as I could. So now that I'm finally in the very recently, past couple months, working on this memorization, the first 100 lines of the Iliad, I appreciate the video so much more because since I'm familiar with every line that he said, he got to like, I don't know, around line 30 or so. Um, I know what every single word means that he says now. I know everything. And so the way the all the inflection in his voice and the way he's playing the parts, because he's playing the priest who's begging for his daughter back, and then Agamemnon says, "No way, no, she's gonna be old lady, and you're gonna be dead if you ever come around here again." Like all that stuff, and he's acting it really well. The thing too that I was impressed by is while he's still using for the most part, the conventional pronunciation of English schools, which is it's a version of Erasmian pronunciation, is it can be called. For the most part, though, he has some other things actually aren't pretty bad when it comes to reconstructed pronunciations. Is He has the meter, and he was taught that, and he was taught to memorize it that way. I think it's just like many Achilleus. I'm trying to remember I can't really do his accent in the Greek. I haven't studied that enough to do it in a way that could be recognizable. But he has the meter. He knows what he's saying. He's clearly memorized it, and it was entertaining before I knew what he was saying, and it's even more entertaining now that I do. The only critique, or I guess I was proud that I was able to recognize something, is that he actually missed some lines, or he skipped them. He had to skip them deliberately because he had just forgotten since his schoolboy days and he hadn't looked at it again, or he just left them out because he didn't skip any important things as far as like the story of the beginning lines. Everything that was there that was relevant of who was talking to whom, the whole proemium, the proem, all 7 lines were intact, and then a couple he skipped. It's almost like he was just summarizing it in a way. Um, so I don't know if that was deliberate or accidental, but that's the only, critique other than is using a conventional pronunciation. It's a tremendous thing, and his advice that it's good for meditation is something that I haven't quite gotten to the, kind of serenity of meditation, but I have found myself just walking around the house or, I don't know, while going for a walk or running. And the line, it just bubbles to the surface here in the lines because it's a little part of my daily life is working on it. So, but I'm not trying to work on it. It just comes up because it has a rhythm and also because I've given it a teeny bit of a melody and also because it's like a song that energizes you. It's fun. It just comes to me and I'm either babbling it to myself and I don't even notice, or I do and I'm having fun. And yeah, a meditation. I haven't gotten to that point yet, but it's definitely quite joyous to recite it aloud, just like Kephalos told me it would be.
Mm. Well, meditation is its own rabbit hole, but yes, that's the core of why I started memorizing the Sanskrit. And those texts are for meditation and they are about the topic of mind and meditation. So I can recommend those at some point, but I think a similar effect comes from just, I don't recite it in this way, but I often, for solace, when things are feel like Groundhog Day, I'll whip out some Shakespeare. If there be nothing new but that which is, hath been before, how are our brains beguiled? Like it's power, it's magic in a way, in the sense that okay, things are repeating, but it ain't new. Shakespeare said it, so it must be true. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that that levels adds a level of dimension to his character and so forth, and it certainly I thought was just unexpected and wild and wonderful in many ways. So
Hmm.
the final thing I want to ask you, I mean, I feel like I could talk all day, but and hopefully one day we will meet in the real world or do this again on in internet world. But I want to ask you about the internet because I found your stuff some time ago and it was like, oh man, I really gotta make good on what I started with in Latin back in university. And really my focus then was biblical Hebrew, but we had these different things to do and so forth, but Latin and Greek were just done to get done for what the requirements were and all that sort of stuff. um, but I got an email from you about the Iliad 100. And then I followed and was looking at your video where you're talking about it and just doing basic Latin practice, getting the gist of things, what you're saying there. And I was just thinking, this is such a tragedy because I've been subscribed to your channel for so long, but I have not seen a video come up in the feed of your stuff, right? And it's not like I didn't watch enough when I was watching it for the algorithms to give me more. And so what this is leading to is the question of how do you advise people to take command of things? Because one thing that I find more and more in the world is I don't want more internet, but I do want more of the thing that the algorithms used to be more giving of. Now it just seems like it all disappears. So, what do you suggest to people uh, to take command and then not just leave algorithms to remind you, which they may never do? And then well, I got to be on some dude's email list, and then I don't, like it's just like I think we all want less and less internet, and yet all the good stuff is on the internet, but we're relying on the internet to remind us to do the thing. And I was just so surprised when I went over there and I realized, like, wow, like you didn't stop doing YouTube stuff, but I haven't seen you come up in forever. And I asked myself, like, what can I do? I mean, I've got Latin textbooks around and there I see them, and that's a much better reminder, but I really want to see more of your stuff. So I just wonder generally what you do yourself, how you manage the internet as a learner, use
Oh,
it
yeah.
use it well, how it impedes you, issues you've had, solutions because
Oh,
you're
that's a
doing it. You're
great.
doing the real
I
thing.
Oh, well, I haven't really thought about it. It's interesting being a content creator and enjoying that part of the being in the world. Um, because I also am very much a consumer of content, especially YouTube, especially educational videos. Like I said, the most frivolous thing I do. uh, well, I guess maybe the most frivolous thing I do is feed the birds at bird feeders at my house because I really like that. That's probably that's actually I discovered. Hey, I have a hobby because I haven't had a hobby as long as I can remember. Because everything I do, I turn into something that's, I don't know, it's got to be important, or I want to really learn this language or teach it or something that's highly utilitarian to my own ends. But maybe that feeding birds, which is just for the birds and my own enjoyment of watching them as that. But otherwise, as far as frivolous stuff, I like watching a lot of reviews of movies and things like that, where they praise the movie it's good, and then maybe I'll go see it, and they make fun of the movie or the TV show it's bad, or they'll usually it's entertaining because they dissect its elements in some way that might be witty or even just analytical. I find that all really, really interesting. And what you're talking about algorithm wise with YouTube, which I is the only social media, which it barely is a social media platform, considering how it's unlike say Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, where everybody essentially is on the same par, same level, and everybody could be, I mean, anybody could create a creator on YouTube, but the vast majority of people are not contributing anything on who are going to YouTube just to watch stuff. It'd be great if there'd be more. Um, More is always better as far as to adding to the collective human knowledge that we have. But yeah, that's the only thing is because I was thinking, as you mentioned now, about how I started recently looking at more of your videos and being, of course, enamored with all of the stuff that I don't know nothing about as far as memory palaces and PAO and all that stuff. And then what has happened in the past couple of days is that I've been getting all kinds of videos, of course, seeing yours and seeing more of them, which is great, come up in my YouTube feed, but also of other people who are doing similar things. So the YouTubers I never knew about. Like, oh, this is interesting and useful. The algorithm was right, but I've been seeing less of, say, what else? Been looking at some nutritional science things, or less of fitness things I was looking at before. Far fewer of those are coming up. And so, how does one manage that with? And this makes me think of what I did. I remember back in 2020 and COVID. One thing that I mean, I was was fine with so I didn't suffer any kind of hardship due to COVID like so many other people did. But I did being sequestered as we all were, the vast majority of us inside more than ever, is realizing the impact of notifications on my phone and what they were having. Because anytime I might have gotten, some kind of notification from Instagram, even maybe a like on a photo or something from Facebook or all kinds of different things, the phone itself would buzz, and there'd be some kind of a banner, or there's a pop-up notification of some kind or other. And I realized that I was able to consciously perceive that it was increasing my stress level. And I'm so glad I realized that, because then I realized I'm going to turn off these notifications. I have a whole bunch of unread emails of things, of lists from thousands from over the years that are just random things that I was signed up for, that used to come up as a little red dot. I have an iPhone, and it would be a number of thousands of emails I hadn't read. They're just irrelevant things, and I just hadn't opened them. And I'd learned somewhere, maybe some YouTuber mentioned it, that these are things that are distracting and actually add a teensy little bit of stress of something that your brain has to worry about. It's like the thinking of a computer, something of your brain as something like a computer that has a limited amount of RAM, and therefore can be overwhelmed by having just a little, like if we open too many windows on our computer's browser, eventually it may crash, trying to keep everything in its working active memory. And using that analogy, I was able to realize, yeah, I don't need to have that. Yeah, emails from 10 years ago about, whatever, newsletter of the nature preserve that I haven't read in forever. I'm never going to. And I looked at, I went through all those, and I also made all the emails read. So anyway, I don't get not a notification or any kind of buzzing from anything except the most critical messages from loved ones. And the other thing I did, which pertains to YouTube, was I understanding the little bell icon is really managing that. So for example, for your channel, I have the little bell icon on. So now whenever you put out a new video, I'll get a notification. So for the channels that I really want to follow, I'd say that's by far my most significant use of the internet when it comes to new things. Old things, I'm always looking at ancient texts and ancient Greek and Latin stuff, but dictionaries and references and stuff like that. But otherwise, my major use of the internet is definitely consumption-wise is YouTube. Lots of educational stuff that I like to watch there. And for those things that I want to see more of, I make sure that I have the bell icon on so I get notifications of the new video. Because otherwise, I won't see it. And occasionally I have to go back and I keep getting notifications for, I don't know, maybe this fitness YouTube channel that yeah, I don't really need to see that as much anymore. I got a lot in front. I don't need to see this new I don't know, biceps exercise or something. I'm trying to come up with something at the top of my head. And so I might then go to my notifications, that channel, and not unsubscribe, but just change it to not getting every single time there's a new video uploaded.
Right.
Um, that is the only thing I can think of because otherwise we are totally beholden to these algorithms over which we have zero control, only a small amount of influence. And I also mostly eschew the other social media. The fact that I've been making reels every day for a couple months now on Instagram as well as shorts on YouTube. I'm still iffy on shorts, but they do seem to have some. I've been liking them more and more from the channels I really like because these YouTubers have been using them in clever ways to have little segments of videos. They're like, oh, well, now I'll go watch the full video because that sounds really interesting. And I wouldn't have watched that 25-minute video or 2-hour video because I didn't have time. But now I've seen the clip, like, okay, now I know what this is about. It's like having a better thumbnail or a better title or something. I really am interested, I might say to myself, and then go watch it. So, but as far as being that involved on Instagram and making stuff, it's something I've barely done. Just as using these things less and less, barely using, these other things. I don't have any positive things to say about TikTok of any kind, especially because certain things like, as far as I've seen from the research, things like say TikTok or Instagram or anything, even the shorts of YouTube that you have this kind of compulsive scrolling thing that we do now, which is now part of our habit as modern technological humans is extremely not good, uh, to use probably a Ben Franklinism of a sort, um, for our psyches. Because we're just so, it's just because I was noticing when I was getting all the notifications, and then when I used to look at whatever on Instagram or even scrolling on Facebook, what they call doom scrolling or whatever. I noticed it was making my memory worse for one, and it was like I don't need this. I have books to memorize, to commit to memory. I have stuff to learn that
Mm.
I just and their life is only so long. I can't learn everything, obviously, but there's a lot that I really want to acquire into my psyche. Interesting too that the psyche, the psyche, the spirit, the soul, as described by say ancient philosophers, like say Plato is that it's just synonymous with the character. So it's that which makes is your part of your makeup. I mean, in a way, then by reading a book which has some certain amount of knowledge, we're adding to our souls, our characters, by
Mm.
bringing that knowledge into ourselves. Whether we adopt it as part of our ethos or not is a different story. But it's that there's only so much time to do that, and is scrolling, even watching more relevant or not, just YouTube videos for entertainment. Okay, maybe we need to decompress now and then. I have nothing against entertainment. I like to watch a lot of TV shows like Star Trek. Like, why do I rewatch Star Trek? My fiance and I, we love watching Star Trek. We've seen it all in English and Italian and Spanish, many times. Uh, it's relaxing. It does have a lot of value to it, but is that more valuable than doing something else? That's could be like reading a book in ancient Greek. Oh no, but there's a lot of reasons that we love that, but it's also completely okay to decompress with things that are frivolous from time to time. But my observation of social media and these internet-based things, specifically stuff like say Instagram and TikTok, just to pick on what seems to be among the worst culprits as far as what it can do to the attention span, psyche, emotional stability. Just because we're seeing things for so short a time in the attention span, it so drains the mental energy that we end up accomplishing much less in life. And I think too that famine, like a malnourishment, for example, the singing of the prisoners of war in under Imperial Japan, for example, they say had American prisoners of war, gave them only a small amount of rice, maybe even a large diet of say just rice, but rice alone leads to malnourishment because it's just not enough. Not only not enough calories, but not enough of the right raw materials that the body needs. So people get a diet of internet junk food. And, now and then it's not so, you get, could have a birthday cake or some, holidays. It's not that big of a deal, but having it constantly, just it leads to bad health, I think has some negative consequences on mental health.
Yeah, no, well, just even though it's a small thing, I never really thought of using the bell icon. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'll be more selective with that. But I think even just simple things like that can really make a huge difference. And the whole digital amnesia thing is real. I was really disappointed when Kaspersky removed their study of digital amnesia from the net. And I don't know, maybe they put it in a place that I can't find it, but I did luckily get a PDF of it. So I know that it exists. It wasn't some Philip K. Dick fantasy that I had. But it is a real problem and it affects me. I know it does because I dropped two words that I should know very well from the 50th verse of the Atmaboda, Turtva and Hatva. They just like completely went out of my head. And while we're talking, I finally got them back. But like that never used to happen. Now, maybe it could be that I'm just a little bit older, but one of the things, and I had the virus twice too, and I really noticed a hit
Mm,
to my memory since then. But I think also as I, you know, try to scan Bruno here, like I can't get that anywhere else. Like it's got to be online, but online is the great I mean, it has to be just because I can't find the print. If I could find the print, I would uh I would do what I could to get it. And maybe I just don't know. My research skills aren't enough, but I find the internet is the great distraction machine, and I try to cape off of it as much as I possibly can. But then it's always
yeah.
this like people like yourself are making great resources and they're digital. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's not necessarily an easy problem to solve, but I appreciate your insights on it and
Sure.
thank you for your inspiration. And I'm going to use that bell icon so I get tagged more.
Okay.
And it would be cool to follow up as you continue with the project if you're open to it.
I'd
And
love to. We'll find out after the end of July if I will have um, indeed memorized the first 100 lines of the Iliad.
well, to me, I think it's really good to have goals, but even just one word, I think is of extraordinary value. And if you do want to get more deeper into it, uh, I think you don't have to take dozens of years to do a text that long. I haven't done a text that long myself, but what I have worked on tells me that it can be doable in faster periods, but there's going to need, at least in my experience with it and my prediction or what have you, there probably will need to be a memory palace component
Hmm.
and maybe many like, but that's you've traveled enough to have more than enough memory palaces. And also, what I found in my research with people, like there's a guy, Ashley Strand, who was on my podcast recently. He recites the entire book of Mark from memory. And
Wow.
so one of the things he reached out to me, he was like, I would never use a memory palace, but as we talked, it turns out, there is a memory palace component to it. It's just not necessarily thought about that way. So,
Hmm.
and there's another guy, Mike McKinley. He had done, I think, 69 Psalms, and he told me he did it without a memory palace. But when I start picking around in exactly what's happening in the practice, there is a spatial component to it that may as well be the memory palace. So anyway, I'm not trying to,
Hmm.
to twist anybody's arm or convince them, but I can't quite see how that amount of volume ever was possible without a memory palace component because I don't see it in the traditional texts
Hmm.
describing how these things were done. And in my own practice, like even with the memory palace, it's still
Oh,
a fair amount. But places
good
to look if you're
question.
interested, because I know you like Italy. Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci apparently had extraordinary recall. He took polyglottinous, can I say? He took Bibles with multiple languages from Italy to Macau, and he died in China. And what Jonathan D. Spence is the guy who wrote The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. He says in there that Matteo Ricci's memory really hit. He had a run for his money when he got to Macau and China, because those guys, they also could memorize books and they were reciting them backwards
Oh, wow.
just to show him up a little. So
Wow.
anyway, interesting things, and it's doable. But Matteo Ricci also had memory palaces.
That's something I even forgot to mention. I'm not memorizing the first 100 lines of the Iliad in order.
Well, that's good.
I'm memorizing them from. So I wish this has been the beginning of the podcast. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible because I'm sure your dear listeners are well they've heard quite a lot. So the technique that I'm using is something that other people have used this. I ended up trying to come up with a catchy name for it years ago when I wanted to teach my students to do it and other people to do it because I came to it independently, which is to start at the end of a line of could be numbers, could be it could be a phone number, could be a credit card number, whatever you need to know, personal information. You just need to have memorized passwords, and you need to have it memorize because if you don't, you might be in trouble. Or if you're trying to memorize a poem, or I had to memorize stuff when I was in flight school, and I found that it has sometimes had to be because like an emergency procedure for flying, say, the Black Hawk helicopter, you have to know it in perfect order. There's no mistakes permitted, or you could die, and you're
Yeah.
tested on that. So it's very, very important to have some things you really know well. Or for the poem, so what I've been doing is memorizing in a backwards fashion. I ended up calling Ranieri reverse recall, again whimsically where I would take, say, the last syllable or line of say the Aeneid, say maybe say just the first line. Say I want to memorize the first line, which is "Men inae detea peleia deo Achilleus." I might start with the last word, Achilleus, and then add backwards this previous syllable or previous word, looking at the text usually. Peleia deo Achilleus,
Mm.
and then and then the word prior to that would um Atea Peleia Deo Achilleos. And my notion of the reason why I thought this was a good idea was what I'm doing is instead of trudging into the thicket of the not of knowledge that's of lack of knowledge where it's darker and darker, I've already illuminated the path ahead of me, so the further I go, the better I know it. Does this technique have a name other than Ranieri reverse recall, which is what I've been calling it for years?
Old school, my friend.
I thought it was.
So,
Was it?
uh, if you read Damon, I would love your opinion on this. Okay, so
Mhm.
we might as well cover this since we're already like deep in the weeds. Okay, so a long time ago when I started memorizing backwards to a degree. So I actually do this in different ways, and I call it recall rehearsal. It's in Aristotle, or at least I got the idea from Aristotle. So where to start with this? So I said I don't know how my pronunciation is, but omnium expendendorum prima essipentia in qua perfecti boni forma consistit. When I memorize that, I look at the last word first, right? I get a sense of the whole thing, but when I memorize it, I go omnium uh, prima sapientia or qua. Like I do the words out of order, right? I can't really do it after because I'm so used to saying it forward. But even that
Right.
Sanskrit where I dropped Turtva Moharnavam Hatva Ragadresh Yoga Shantasanta Yukta Ramo Varajate. I would do Varajate, skip Ramo, do Shantasanta Yukta.
Hmm.
My mouth is not working right now. This is another thing I wanted to ask about pronunciation, but for a different time because I have like a disease in my mouth. I have angular chylitis, and it's like, and I have such dry mouth. I have to drink all the time, and it's like that also like screws up my I'd love to have a bigger ego and just be like, man, I nail this all the time, but I can't even approach it because I have so much pain associated with my mouth. But anyway, the whole thing is,
Ooh.
if you want to codify a pattern, these are the things that the keyboard warriors never consider with pronunciations like nuclear. But anyway, uh, if you want to think about it in a patterned way, and I usually tend to do it in a patterned way because I want it in long-term memory as quickly as possible, a line of a text. So I look at the whole line and I think already like what's going to be the end point. I call that tamping down. It's like a weird way of thinking about it, but it's kind of just like you know, preparing your tobacco with a pipe first, and you kind of like you tamp it, and you think, I got room for this much more, so you already take that. I don't smoke a pipe, but I'm just imagining this. You like have an estimation of what's going on, and you
Yeah.
tamp it down, and you think like, what's the space going to be, and then you already have a sense of how much tobacco you're going to add later. I don't know, whatever. I think of it as tamping down. So then I lay out my images in the memory palace. So if it's omnium expendorum prima esse pensi in qua perfecti boni forma consistit, it's just like as linear as possible. But then I can skip the words. So I go forward, I go backward, I go from the middle to the beginning, the middle to the end, and then I go yeah, 1, 3, 5, 7, 10, whatever number of words it is. I did that even with my TEDx talk, not with the words though, but with the individual sentences. So I did sentence 61, sentence 59, and I wrote them out
Mm.
just so I was like as bulletproof as possible, especially with my mouth issues, which I did mess it up, by the way, but that's a different story for a different day. But the whole thing is I really do it. Like I do the real work to get this stuff into long-term memory as quickly as I can. I sometimes make mistakes and drop words like Boris dropping lines or whatever. It just happens. But that's a codified way of doing it. And so if you ever do read De Maria from Aristotle, I'd be very curious about you because this is where I got this idea. And Richard Sorabji has a wonderful book about Aristotle and memory, but he gets to this part about Aristotle talking about entering the middle of the alphabet. And he's like, I have no idea what Aristotle is talking about. And I'm like, of course, he's talking about using the memory palace in a codified way. You go from the beginning to the end, you go from the middle to the end, you go from the middle to the
Mm.
beginning. Because I believe what Aristotle is saying there is that every station it has an alphabetical letter. But my suspicion is that he also means it has a number at the same time. So it's bi-direction.
Well,
And
Greek numerals are just the letters of the alphabet,
yeah, well, that's why it's my suspicion. But also, you have the gematria in Hebrew, which is also, but it's a
just
one
like
step.
Hebrew. Yeah.
It's one step further. It's number, it's alphabet, and it's object, right? Which
Right.
is where the
Yeah,
PAO.
hand or an eye, right?
I
With
believe this
wow
is
or
where
Bob. It's
PAO comes from, person, action, object. I think it comes from the
yeah.
gematria, or it comes from wherever the gematria comes from. Like
Mm.
I think in Finnegan's Wake, Joyce says you can get Adam on your lap and you can dial all the way back to him and he still won't know. He was the one created by God and he still won't know where it all comes from. Anyway, I think that's in Finnegan's Wake, something like that. So anyway, that's the thing. So your method and whatever you want to call it, I love that proliferation of things. But
Yeah.
I think there's both if you glom onto it, there's a way to refine it a little bit, make it faster. And I think you'll be fascinated to see how this has all been there all along for
Oh, I
thousands
have
of
no
years.
doubt.
Uh, but not
I
necessarily,
always imagine
but
so.
not necessarily exactly in the way that you have expressed it.
Hmm.
But backward memorization, it's a thing. There's a
It's
guy
so
on.
useful.
I could never find the link again, but there's a guy. He's sitting there, and they're saying, "Okay, verse 7 in the Bhagavad Gita," and he says forward or backward. I mean, I don't remember that he does it exactly this way, but he actually starts. I knew the lines that he was memorizing, and I was like, he's doing it backwards just to show off. I wish I could find it again, but anyway, they're just grilling him on the Bhagavad Gita, and he's just ripping it out from memory based on the actual verse numbers, and then he does it backward. It's just like I may have
Man.
confabulated it, but there's a video something like that. That's one of the craziest things about memories. I think David Lynch got it best in Lost Highway, where he has a character say, "Sometimes I remember things the way I remember them, not necessarily the way they happened." And that's not even the exact line. Sometimes I remember things the way I want to remember them. But anyway, it's something like that. But it's a great line because I'm aware of the problem of confabulation, and it's one of the when it comes to humility and all that sort of stuff, it's one of the things I worry about the most. It's just like every time that you tell a story, the scientists say you're changing the location of the memory in your brain, and therefore you're likely changing the thing. And that's one of the reasons why I love verbatim memorization so much, because it is, well, it actually is not as clear as possible, because I was trying to show somebody something the other day, and it was Pacassia in the way that I memorized it, but then it was different in a different screen, and I felt embarrassed all of a sudden. But then I actually looked at it, and it's actually two different words in two different texts. So I did
Hmm.
memorize it correctly. Anyway, memory is it's a deep rabbit hole. Thank you for indulging me on your conclusion. But I think those issues are, if you're going to do long form verbatim, those issues come up and they fascinate me more than right, wrong, correct, incorrect. It's
Mm.
wow, what is going on in this strange thing called memory?
Mm.
It's definitely Star
Well
Trek
said,
in
sir.
terms of you know, the outer reaches of beyond all places to go, and that's what Bruno thought, and he's fascinating too. So,
Mm.
where can people find your stuff that I found so compelling? Um, Polymathy is the channel, if I said that correctly.
Absolutely,
But
it's
there
you
are other
did.
channels.
There's other there. I have two main channels of significance, which are Polymathy. It's like polymath, little y at the end, and the other is Scorpiomartianus, which sounds harder than it is. It's just Scorpio, Martian, U.S. And if you want to remember that, because I'm American, so that's one way to remember. It's just Scorpiomartianus, and that's that channel. It's all content in Latin and ancient Greek, a little at ancient Egyptian. I haven't done much yet on the Egyptian side yet. And yeah, that's where you can find myself. Or LukeRanieri.com gives links to all those things and some spreadsheets I've made about pronunciation chronology, some other stuff that is there.
Beautiful. Well, it's tremendous work. I admire it in all ways, both the astonishing amount of production and the real work that's in it about what you are producing. So,
The feeling's mutual,
congratulations
Anthony.
on that, and thank you for being here and for your time and your generosity and all your insight and wisdom. And I look forward to catching up sometime.
Thank you, sir. I feel the same. I look forward to it.
I want to thank Luke again for his time and expertise that he shared with us. And also, I want to demonstrate a little bit of something that is me, talking my walk and walking my talk. And the suggestion that lingua latina per se illustrata can help a person get to Bruno. Well, I'm more than a little skeptical of this, but I've always said that a true skeptic actually tests their skepticism. So I've seen this before and worked with it a little bit before, but only in a digital version. And I know that digital versions are a dead end, especially for me. So after speaking with Luke, I got a physical copy of the book and started with it. And immediately it already connects one to the text. But I had studied Latin in university, and the textbook at that time was really just, here's some stuff, grammar tables, declension and conjugation, blah, blah, blah. Now go and read Plautus. Okay, cool. And then, you have these very facile tests, really. But at the end of the day, the idea that that's lingua latina is going to get to Bruno has to be tried. Tentenda via, I think it says in Latin, the way must be tried. Tentenda via est, maybe. Digging deep here in memory. But when I was in university, one thing that I did to deal with tables, and I want to share it with you, and you can work out your own method from there, is to use a memory palace for declension and conjugation. And the beauty of doing this is that you can, well, first of all, learn what are the different cases that you need to decline into. And, conjugation and declension, sometimes I mix these terms up in my minds, but they're different things. And once you start to understand what they are, you can start to use them. But it can be a huge thing just to figure out what the heck is going on here, like first person, second person, plural, singular, all that stuff, right? So you just kind of got to get started. And one thing that you can do is just make a simple memory palace. So in the illustration that I've recreated here for you and slightly modified since how that I did it in university and in language class when I was in Germany and so forth, the square represents the wall of my high school friend Mike's home. And that's really all you got to do is draw a square. And then what I suggest that you do is have the arrangement in a way that works for you, where you can have all of the declensions, in this case on a declension table, triggered through active recall. So on mine, I have Chomsky on the top left. Now, Chomsky is not a direct trigger. His name is Noam Chomsky, and so that helps me remember that that's the spot where the nominative is going to take place. And then below that, I have Sega. Now, there is no declension called Sega, but there is the genitive. So Sega Genesis helps remind me of what this is. And then below that, I have the Star Trek symbol. I don't draw very well, and it's not about drawing well. It's just something that triggers to my mind, oh, that's the Star Trek symbol. So data for dative as a declension. And then you have an ACD guitar player, Angus Young, for accusative, ACDC accusative, and then you have the ablative with ABBA, and then you have a singer with a microphone for vocative. And then this is all placed very, very simply on a wall, and you can use it again and again if you want. And I just highly recommend that you get into this. The central image in the middle of the wall can change from word to word. Now, I know there's many more kinds of declension and so forth, but just as a starter, to help you start learning these things, start with something like a word you need to learn, big, right? So I have a chess piece in this particular image, and Magnus Carlsen is used for the word Magnus, big, and then you just decline it. So, you're going to have Magnus and Magni for the nominative, the singular and the plural. So you can have Magneto or Magnus Carlsen or whoever you want kneeing the American flag for us, right? And then you go down to the next one into, which would be in this case the genitive, because you have the Sega there, and I think you have Magni again and Magnorum, right? So if that's correct, that's just all referencing the actual declination that needs to take place for the kind in a space on a wall. So again, you got to kind of adapt this to yourself, but that's one way that I worked it out back then. It's not as refined as I worked it out now, but it's much, much better. And I just wanted to share that with you if you're learning these things. And we'll see how it goes with my own little project here. I am a little bit skeptical that I will reach being able to translate Bruno myself, but can't get there if you don't start and if you don't keep going. So again, I know things are a little more complicated because there are different forms of declension, but we learn from principle and develop our memory skills so we can avoid getting caught, stopped, enslaved to the zillions of words out there, and just make progress step by step by step. And once you memorize a few declensions, you're really going to get good to go. And when you memorize a couple of conjugations and you start learning about tense and number and all that sort of stuff, it's just a matter of getting started, keep going and going and going and going. And, you can tether things together by just reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And to me, as mentioned in this interview with Luke, that's going to be the most difficult thing, because I kind of do want to be able to speak Latin, but at the same time, there's only so many hours in the day when I'm writing massive books and on and on and on. But you got to just work with what you've got in your own situation, and you can. And it's going to be very, very important for the life of your brain. So thank you for being part of this mission. That is part of where I'm going and why I really want to get into deeper and deeper language learning projects, because it's known that language learning helps create cognitive reserve, it's called in science, a defense against dementia and Alzheimer's. And I worry all the time that I'm already in early cognitive decline and probably always have been. I use memory techniques for better memory, not the fantasy of perfect memory, although that fantasy of perfect memory is a driver, because who knows, maybe the universe has a truly ineffable character to it, and it is pulling us with it as it builds itself out of itself. So thanks as always for joining me on this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. And if you're watching on the YouTubes, maybe you want to carry on with my interview with Ashley Strand, the actor who committed the entirety of the Book of Mark to his memory and recites it live from the stage. Inspiring stuff indeed.